Ah, Nic, Siim, nice to see you both.
Yeah,
Likewise.
nice to see you all.
This is my first roundtable, so I'm honoured to share it with you two, fellow knights of the roundtable. And the theme of today's discussion is dietary supplements for longevity. And I thought it might be fun to begin with a few lightning round questions. If you were to imagine a situation in which resources are no issue, so you have all the time, all the money, and you get to give a body weight adjusted dose of up to 2 nutraceuticals and or drugs to every adult aged 30 or older, and you could choose the dose and the frequency if you want people to live longer and have as long a health span as possible. Which would you pick? And I'm going to start with you, Nic, because alphabetically you come first.
Thanks. 2 molecules that I can give people. It's not going to help necessarily with a lifespan, but it is going to help with health span, and I would argue creatine. I guess it doesn't really necessarily have to be weight adjusted, but that would be one of them. The other one, again, off the top of my head, would be, let's say, something a little more potent like rapamycin, which probably, at least based off of what I've seen, seems to have some pretty promising results in terms of longevity and health span. So those are my 2 choices.
What do you go for, Siim? That's given you some time to think about it.
There's obviously a difference between like health span and lifespan. I think creatine is, for sure, like one of the best health span supplements for brain performance and physical performance. Arguably, if you extend health span, you probably extend lifespan as well a little bit. Creatine is, like a kind of safe bet that especially like older people would benefit a lot from. Number 2, I would say probably is like, let's say, like a high quality omega-3 supplement, mostly for like cardiovascular benefits, brain benefits, helps with inflammation and immunity and all those other related metabolic benefits. And, higher blood omega-3 levels are associated with longevity. So there might be something there. If I were to add like an actual, let's say, lifespan pharmaceutical, then rapamycin is quite interesting, and I would think that it has potential. Maybe in the future we'll see in the next few years. Maybe there are some clinical trials on that. But I would, for the general population, I would think that actually something like acarbose or metformin would be also relatively safe bet, because it's pretty safe, and most people just have slightly higher blood sugar and slightly worse blood markers than it should be for optimal longevity. The lifespan data about metformin isn't that convincing. Acarbose might be more convincing than metformin, but for just the idea of postponing metabolic disease and reducing the risk of diabetes, that would probably be one of the like actual pharmaceuticals that could also have some effects.
I too would pick creatine monohydrate, and then my second choice would probably be a GLP-1 receptor agonist. If we're speaking about the general population, which I would choose, I'm not sure. It probably wouldn't be tirzepatide. It would probably be semaglutide, because we know quite a lot about it at this point. It would be a relatively low dose, and I'm not saying that it's something that would benefit everyone. It probably wouldn't benefit any of the 3 of us, for instance. But if we're speaking about the Gen Pop, then I think it's a really strong choice, particularly when coupled with creatine. And interestingly, if you do consider the cost of distributing that to everyone, and you look at that relative to the potential healthcare savings, then right now it wouldn't make financial sense, because semaglutide is really expensive. And there was recently an economic analysis looking at that, and tirzepatide and a couple of other obesity medications. But cost isn't a factor in this hypothetical scenario. If cost were a factor, then would you modify your responses? For creatine, I don't think you would. So we can disregard that and instead focus on the other choices.
Rapamycin is definitely coming down in cost. There's a few companies that sell it now that have it not super, super expensive, but it's definitely pricier. Metformin is much, much cheaper. So I might be convinced to go that route, because I really like Siim's thought process on it, especially if you're talking about the general population. especially as you get older, you might be getting into that pre-diabetic level. So potentially metformin would be a great benefit in that regard. So yeah, I could be swayed on that.
Because GLP-1s have like a double whammy effect that they also help with weight loss in addition to blood sugar. So in that sense, they're more potent than metformin. I wouldn't know which one to choose. Depends, on if there's no cost, then perhaps some future generation GLP-1s that are safer. Maybe not as potent as the one that is used for obesity. Maybe there's like something that's 50% as effective as the Ozempic or something like that. Maybe that would be more suitable for the general population.
And just to be clear, metformin is a cheap drug. So
yeah,
your low-cost option can remain metformin, which might be my choice. I'm not sure. It's a good candidate. Another one that I think might prove to be very interesting is taurine. And we'll come back to that later. And on that subject, we might come back to it now, I don't know. What are a couple of the most underappreciated or under-recognized yet promising geroprotectors, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think taurine might be one of those examples. There's actually quite a lot of like research about taurine's effect on metabolic health and blood pressure, plus some exercise performance benefits. Compared to like the cost and the safety, then it's pretty underappreciated. It's obviously not as cheap and effective as a creatine. Even now, you could say that creatine is still underrated, but taurine is a pretty good one.
I mean, taurine's excellent. Yeah, I'll go a different direction. I'm kind of torn actually between two, but I would go.
You get two choices, Nic.
Oh, I get two choices. I'm no longer torn. In that case, I would go curcumin. I've been doing a lot more research on curcumin, and I've been doing research on blood sugar, how it helps people with prediabetes, diabetes. Also, it seems to have some pretty profound effects on osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. So my vote goes to curcumin. The other one is a combination supplement. So hopefully you'll allow this, Master Greg. But lutein and zeaxanthin are pretty high up. They're not ones that are discussed that much, except in the ocular community, which we are big fans of. In terms of the studies on lutein and zeaxanthin, they seem to be really effective. I mean, there's plenty of clinical trials that show improvements in eye health. And just because of the nature of the molecules, they also seem to affect the brain. At least lutein, I've seen some evidence for. I'll go with those 2/3 molecules that are underappreciated.
I like lutein and zeaxanthin as well. And the second one for me would be astaxanthin, which is also a carotenoid. Like, there's actually the lifespan data is quite interesting that it helps with. Lifespan, it's like senolytic. It has skin protective effects against UV radiation. It has like some metabolic effects and has been seen to lower inflammation in clinical trials, but that's not the main, I guess, effect. It's mostly for the skin. Probably has some brain benefits as well as a carotenoid.
I'm a fan of all of those. My choices will probably be ergothioneine and glucosamine sulfate as something that is truly under-recognized and has some real potential.
Yeah, those are good choices.
We'll come back to those and discuss them in more detail later. What about underrated or under-recognized medications? Going to restrict you to a single choice in this instance.
Actually, which you gave on your second molecule, I think GLP-1 receptor agonists, some people are really into them. And then other people think drug equals bad, so therefore try to avoid it at all costs. And I think that the data is incredible in relation to those. So I think that they're for a large group of individuals that are extremely reticent to jump on any sort of drug. If the label drug or pharma is associated to it, they will not touch it. I would say that's a bad move in a lot of circumstances. Maybe not every circumstance, but in a lot of circumstances, because they can help with blood sugar regulation, weight, triglycerides, LDL, everything. It covers so much. So, and it can really help people that are really struggling with with making sure that they're consuming the appropriate foods in the appropriate amounts. And there's actually even some research in relation to its effects on the brain that it can change how people perceive, let's say, junk food. That would be my choice, even though plenty of people know about it. I don't necessarily know if they appreciate the potency and the overwhelming positive effects that come with them.
Yeah, I think the kind of negative side effects are a bit overhyped, and they're like quite manageable with like diet and resistance training and those just general healthy lifestyle principles. It's relatively safe. My choice, so yeah, I'm thinking of, okay, when it comes to like general like life-saving effects, not directly, but let's say if you take the drug, then you improve certain outcomes, then I would say like some sort of blood pressure medication is probably very important, in the sense that high blood pressure is one of those things that very fast will decline your health compared to obesity. It's going to take decades, but with blood pressure, the kind of immediate consequences are a bit more detrimental, that you want to get your blood pressure in check quite fast, and you don't want to have like high blood pressure for long periods of time. So in that sense, the blood pressure medications are underrated, but I wouldn't never like think it's a long-term solution, or like that what most people would want to take. Yes, you want to improve your lifestyle, you want to get off the blood pressure medication as fast as possible, but as a quick fix, it's worse to have the high blood pressure than it is to take short-term blood pressure medication, in my opinion. In a general sense, I would probably, again, maybe some sort of blood sugar medication, acarbose or metformin is a bit underrated. Like there is, with metformin, there's some side effects, this increased lactic acid, and might affect androgens and might lower VO2 max, for example. Again, the effects outweigh some of the side effects for people who do struggle with blood sugar and metabolic issues.
Nic, I find it ironic that a lot of those people who are anti-drugs and anti-medications are also keen caffeine consumers.
Methylene blue.
Yeah. And then regarding the GLP-1 receptor agonists and food intake, that seems to be true of addiction in general. There are these studies ongoing now looking at things like addiction to nicotine and whether they might be useful in that context. And then Siim, regarding blood pressure medications, I think they're a really interesting choice. And it raises an intriguing tangent, which is about substances that directly target the biology of aging, or things that pick people off prematurely. So in this case, cardiovascular disease being a huge killer. And my choice would be quite similar to yours. Initially, these drugs were developed as blood pressure lowering medications, but I'd probably choose PDE5 inhibitors like sildenafil and tadalafil, Viagra or Cialis. Sildenafil, interestingly, is being studied in the ITP now as a candidate gerotherapeutic. People do seem to live longer when they take them, in part due to lower rates of cardiovascular disease. And they seem to have some very protective effects in the brain too, which surely relates in part to vascular function. But there are data associating their use with lower risk of Alzheimer's disease.
It's actually one of my choices of thinking the Viagra and Cialis, because like with age, men's their erection quality declines, blood flow declines, and PDE5 inhibitors, they support blood flow through nitric oxide, and they also lower blood pressure. So a lot of cardiovascular benefits and sexual benefits.
But those positive effects on quality of life in general. If you've got a better romantic relationship, then that's going to be good for you and have some indirect positive actions on your health. And then just to detour from supplements briefly, I thought it'd be fun just to ask you guys a few personal questions since I put you on the line. One of them is, what's the most stupid thing that you've done in the name of health or fitness, Nic? It doesn't have to be the most stupid if it's something that you don't want to share. But I think we've both been interested in these subjects for a while. I know that I, for one, have done some pretty stupid things over the years.
Most of it comes down to when I was first getting into exercise and lifting weights and whatnot, the vanity of it all. But I think the stupidest thing that I did was, it's going to come off like a humble brag, which I really don't want it to. When I first started lifting weights, I lifted weights for 2.5 years, and I did these 3-hour marathon workouts, and I did them every other day because I thought you had to stimulate your musculature every 48 hours. You gave yourself one rest day and then you would lift again. And it was just this antiquated, dumb idea. And I did that for 2.5 years. I worked through injuries. Didn't matter if I was injured. Didn't matter if I was sick, which is horrible to do. But just 2.5 years of obsession and psychological torture just so I could achieve the body of a Greek god. By the way, did not achieve. So it didn't really work out for me. I also gained 90 pounds. Some of it was muscle, obviously, if you're going to be working out for 2.5 years straight, but I gained a lot of fat for sure. So I never repeated that mistake. But I would say that's among them for sure. I can't think of another one off the top of my head, but I'm sure I had plenty of others.
I did like the polyphasic sleep experiment where I slept for like 4 hours throughout the 24-hour period for 100 days. Yeah, that wasn't necessarily like a health thing. I knew it wasn't like a health achievement, but I just wanted to try it out, like see if you can function doing that. It definitely had like short-term consequences.
If you had to buy AG1, IM8, or have someone take $30 out of your pocket, which of the three would you choose?
Okay, first of all, you did not answer the previous question.
Sorry. Okay.
You can't escape.
Well, I think I told this story on the podcast before, but I nearly crushed myself under a massive wardrobe doing pull-ups while I was locked down. And that wardrobe was really heavy. And I basically got saved by a bed and escaped with a €300 fine because I was in Palermo, the capital of Sicily at the time. We were being good citizens and we were all cooped up for 5 days for fear of spreading COVID. Neither of us had COVID, so be it. Other choice would probably be, and this cracks me up to think about, it's very relevant to today. When I was 15, I first took creatine. And when I put in my order from some UK supplement company, I also bought some glutamine powder because it was popular at the time, and some caffeine powder for pre-workout, obviously. I think one of the nurses or someone at school found the powders and they were terrified of my creatine consumption. And they completely disregarded the fact that I had caffeine powder. And I could readily have killed myself with a few grams of that. Fortunately, I was just smart enough to not take large doses of it. But looking back, that could easily have gone badly wrong. So to return to AG1, IM8, or being $30 down, Nic, what do you go for? Bear in mind that you've got to buy one of these two supplements, or just have someone take $30 out of your pocket.
So, okay, I'll give you an ethical and a non-ethical answer. If I were a non-ethical person, I would take AG1 and then I would start shilling that as the best product in the world and get somebody else to buy it. But considering I consider myself semi-ethical, I would take the loss of the $30. Just because then at least I would know that my money wasn't going to one of those companies.
I would take the IM8, at least because they show the ingredients and you see what you're getting. Plus, my co-author, Dr. James DiNicolantonio, is one of the advisors, so I would support him.
Looking after your friends. Well,
That's
I'm going
good.
to piggyback on Nick's answer and choose his first unethical answer, because you're more ethical than I am, so I'm flogging it straight on eBay. Siim, a question for you. Is Brian Johnson the healthiest person in the world?
The issue is that based on what data, so like he shares his spreadsheet of my biomarkers. First of all, it shows only like 40 markers or something. And second of all, he added the asterisk that it's done over the course of 2 years. So it's not even like a single test, or right now, like he can tell you that I have the best XYZ marker, but that test is, from 2 years ago. First, it's also like, impossible to claim to make, like, because everyone has some different definition of health. And even then with the blood markers, it's also hard to draw like that kind of a conclusion from like a set of blood markers. And after all, he doesn't actually have like, okay, January 2025, all of the blood markers. It's, some of the blood markers are from ages ago, so it's kind of a nitpicking some of the data.
And who would win in a fight, you or Brian?
Well, I think I'm a lot heavier than him. I'm like 82 kilos. He's probably something 75 or.
My money's on you, Siim.
Mine too.
Nic, a couple of questions for you. Baltimore or the Congo?
The Congo.
Nic with an H or Nic without an H?
Without an H, every time I get coffee, I'm like, just because I like messing with people every once in a while. Just whenever I get coffee, I'm like, because they ask for your name, what's your name? And I'm like Nicholas, and then I'm like, without an H, please pronounce it without an H.
Do you guys have one or two favorite comments that people have made on your YouTube videos?
Oh, good gracious. I have.
There are some absolute gems.
Oh.
Well, for me, there's always something like, why do you sound like a robot? It's kind of funny, like it's like 50% people like my voice, and then 50% are like, why does he sound like a robot?
I've gotten a mass amount of different comments. Oh, right now I have kind of a sub arc going on my channel because I just haven't worn a belt when recording my videos and whatnot. So every once in a while I pull up my pants. Don't ask me why I don't wear a belt. I guess it's just not as comfortable as just not wearing a belt. And anyway, people have been begging me to just wear a belt or wear suspenders. So I do enjoy the long list of comments that I've gotten, and I do plan on playing kind of a little bit of a joke on my community just based off that. But I mean, aside from that, you get all the creative insults and really the lack of creativity. I do wish that some of my commenters, when they insult me, that they would be a bit more creative in how they insult me, because I don't know, it's just not as much fun when you have a little bit of a back and forth. I would say the third group is, I've gotten some comments and some messages from people that are truly thankful and really appreciative of the work that I've been able to put out there. I think that we've all been able to put out there. It does mean a lot to me, just because, again, trying to put out good information is difficult to do in this, the world of social media.
And maybe on that subject, do you have a favorite YouTube channel or one that you pay particularly close attention to? And when I ask that question, you can't give each of your channels.
Siim. My vote very much goes to Nutrition Made Simple by Gil Carvalho. I think he's an absolute rock star, and I will continue to sing his praises.
I didn't have like a special favorite YouTube channel. It kind of shifts all the time what I'm just particularly interested in. Sometimes it's like geopolitics, sometimes it's some entertainment, shifts a lot in that sense. But from the health space, I would say maybe Brad Stanfield is a good source of information. It's good that he tries to call out nonsense or tries to look into more details.
Do you have one, Greg?
Let's return. Do I have one?
Yeah.
James Hoffman.
Which of us?
James Hoffman.
James Hoffman. Okay. Coffee nerd.
Okay. I know
yeah.
of him. I think I might know of him because of you.
Probably.
Yeah.
It's great. It's very entertaining. If you like coffee, you'll enjoy it.
Okay.
If you don't like coffee, you might still appreciate the production value and just how quirky he is. I like quirky people.
Mm.
But anyway, returning to dietary supplements, we'll get to geroprotectors shortly, but there are some widely used supplements that target intakes of essential nutrients, so essential fatty acids, essential amino acids, vitamins, minerals. And I don't want to go into any depth here, but I just wanted your hot takes on a couple of these. So Siim, you mentioned the omega-3 fatty acids earlier. Nic, what are your thoughts on these in the context of aging? If you had to summarize those thoughts in the space of a paragraph or less.
Thank you for giving me a limit. I love omega-3s. I think they need to be dosed appropriately, but beyond that, I think they're fantastic for, like Siim mentioned, cardiovascular health, but also brain health. There's some evidence. So yeah, I'm all for it.
And Siim, you feel similarly?
There was the recent study with omega-3s. Omega-3 supplementation was seen to decrease some of the biological age score. Obviously, like it's not very clear what it means or how accurate the test might be, but I wouldn't be surprised that the omega-3s would have that kind of biological effect if it was true.
The study you're referring to is a study by Steve Horvath and his colleagues. And
I think it was him. He was one of the authors. Yeah.
Yeah, and they looked at the effect of around a gram of EPA and DHA from algae oil for a couple of years, I think it was, and they found reductions in both pace of aging. They used the Dunedin pace measure and several second generation epigenetic clocks that we think measure something related to biological age. And they looked at relatively old adults. So the average age was in the mid-70s, which is an important wrinkle because it might be that omega-3 supplements could reduce some proxy of biological age in people with quite low intakes who are quite late in life and therefore have plenty of scope to reduce their biological age, whereas earlier in life that might not be the case. In that study, they also looked at vitamin D, as well as combinations of vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids, and exercise. So what are your thoughts on vitamin D?
I haven't done a ton of reading on vitamin D, but my impression is that, well, okay, I'll say one thing. I do think that the social media landscape has gone absolutely wild with vitamin D to the point where it's just this careening barrel down a hill that has no sense of like stopping. Like adding, 50,000 IUs of vitamin D, I think to me is nonsense. I don't think that there's any need for it. I could be wrong. Maybe in the future I'll read a study where they say you have to be consuming these mega doses, but I have read studies that have indicated that taking these mega doses can be harmful to bone health over many years of consumption or injection, because they're also injectables. Vitamin D is a great supplement. It's just that the dosing, I think, has gone really wild with certain people that I shall not name.
The vitamin D, it has like some evidence from clinical trials that might help with like testosterone or some other benefits. It's hard to say like whether or not taking a vitamin D supplement would be equal to having the vitamin D from the sun. It's probably not like the exact same benefits. I mean, there are some of these clinical trials with vitamin D supplementation that it seemed to reduce all-cause mortality risk slightly, and cancer risk as well, I think, but not heart disease risk, which is interesting. But again, yeah, you ideally want to get it from the sun, but most people aren't spending that much time outside.
I think vitamin D is interesting because it brings up many nuances that we need to consider, like how it interacts with other nutrients. So if you think about cardiovascular risk, then it's different taking vitamin D3 in isolation versus combining it with K2, for instance, how that can influence calcium deposition in different tissues. And then where the vitamin D is coming from. So if it was D2 versus D3 or vitamin D that you synthesize as a result of sun exposure, how the dose interacts with your lifestyle and your genetics too. So you take someone who's got lots of melanin in their skin, that means that they need a larger amount of UVB radiation to synthesize a given amount of vitamin D. For someone like that, let's say someone of African ancestry who's living in the UK, they're probably more likely to benefit from vitamin D supplementation than I am. And then, Nic, I think the point you made is really important. Safety is a real concern. It's fat soluble. There are some things where if you take them in excess, you end up with practically fluorescent urine in the case of B vitamins, or maybe they clear you out at the other side if you take a big dose of magnesium oxide, for instance. but your body doesn't really hold on to them. Whereas vitamin D, being fat soluble, can be stored in your body fat and ultimately could be toxic. And there are these rare case studies of people who have achieved such high levels that they do experience that toxicity. So more is not necessarily better. Finally, multivitamins and multiminerals. What are your thoughts, beginning with you, Nic?
I'm a fan, but I'm not crazy about them. There's a little bit of data from, I forgot the name of the trial, like the MIND trial or something like that, indicating that it can have a very small effect at preserving cognitive function over years.
I think it's the Cosmos
Mind, I think.
The Cocoa one as well.
Yeah, right. And there's a bit more evidence in some other trials indicating that it can be pretty helpful. I just think that the effect is so mild that I think that if a person just has a well-rounded diet, that it's probably not necessary. But if you wanted to have some sort of low dose, I think the way I approach it is I take a multivitamin, but I usually just cut it in half just because I just don't think that I need 100% daily value from this one supplement, especially when you have all the interactions between the different molecules. So yeah, to me, I'm a fan, but it's not like the end of the world if you don't take a multivitamin.
Probably has some effects. How much, hard to say, because every multivitamin is also differently formulated, different amounts of the vitamins and minerals, and some exclude certain minerals, some include additional ones. So yeah, like even with these Cosmos trials or whatever other clinical trials, you're never going to find the exact same kind of formula unless the company is doing their own research. Maybe getting something like, okay, you get a 20% of your daily vitamins and minerals from this supplement, maybe that can be helpful, or maybe 80%, so we don't know necessarily how much is the benefit. If you get more than 100% of certain vitamins and minerals, it can also have some negative side effects. So it's not, like just more is better.
They're not all created equal. And Siim, do you take one? I'm guessing you probably don't.
No, I'm not.
Do you take one when you travel?
No. I mean, from my blood work, I've seen that I don't have any deficiencies, with the exception of like B1 is often slightly low. Like if you measure and you see that, okay, you have low magnesium or B1 or B12, whatever, then you can kind of specifically take that supplement. But it can like be an insurance policy, right? That's one of the reasons people take it. You might not need it if you already have adequate amounts of all the vitamins and minerals.
Blood testing is a subject for another day, just because it's not as if you having insufficient status of a given micronutrient will always show up as low levels of that in your blood. The regulation of those is much more complex than that. And moving on to geroprotectors.
Hold on. What do you think about multivitamins?
I think my thoughts largely overlap with you guys. They're not all created equal. I think you probably should consider different formulations, whether you're a guy or a girl. So if you think about women of reproductive age, for example, who are cycling on a regular basis and therefore losing blood, then they're regularly offloading iron from their bodies. Whereas us guys, we're not doing that unless we actively give blood. And therefore, our micronutrient needs are different. That's just one example. But clearly, the specifics do matter. I think there are some small benefits to be had in certain circumstances, but the benefits probably just relate to the intakes of the individual micronutrients. So, for instance, there are data looking at things like neural tube defects, but that's probably just a function of the fact that there's folic acid in the multivitamin, and the effects of the multivitamin don't seem to be greater than just taking the folic acid in isolation. So I think targeted supplementation would be better, but I do think they have their place, and that's more true of people with lower quality diets. And for me, if I'm traveling to a part of the world where I know I'm going to struggle to access healthy food on a regular basis, so let's say I'm in Southeast Asia for a while and I'm consuming too much fried chicken and white rice because that's all there is available, then in those circumstances, I'll take a multivitamin. And then the rest of the time I won't. I think for the general population, they're not a bad idea. They're not for everyone. My impression is that some people default to taking them as a kind of insurance policy when they really don't need to, and they should actually just stop and think about what they're likely to need from within the multivitamin and be a little bit more specific. What's that, Siim?
Yeah, there's actually research that the people who are the most likely to take a multivitamin are the least likely to need it, and the ones who are least likely to, or like most likely to benefit from it, are the least likely to take it.
That makes sense. So moving on to these anti-aging supplements. And when I say geroprotector, I'm really referring to things that can potentially protect you against aging. So slow the aging process, whether that's systemically or in specific tissues, things that do act on the biology of aging per se. And there are lots of things that we should consider before we choose to try one of these ourselves. And one of them is evidence of their actual effectiveness. Each of us will have a slightly different bar for the level of evidence that we think is necessary for us to consider taking them. Where do you guys set that bar? What kind of evidence do you want to see before you'd consider taking something yourself?
It's hard. How do you define biological aging, and how do you define slowing down it? How do you measure it? How do you know if it's working? So that's there's no clear answer to that. I would say that you would have to rely partly on like animal studies in that area of biological aging and the life extension, because it's just very hard to do in humans. Partly you could rely on some of these different pathways or like the hallmarks of aging as well. So like, okay, at least one of the major ones like mitochondrial dysfunction or chronic inflammation or cell senescence, for example, we pretty much know from human data as well that chronic inflammation accelerates aging and increases the risk of all the chronic diseases and shortens lifespan. So something that would alleviate inflammation theoretically would also just slow down biological aging, maybe not through acting on the process of biological aging directly, but just because inflammation is in excess harmful. I guess the challenge is again like, okay, people who are most likely to take a anti-inflammatory supplement, they're already kind of more health motivated. They don't necessarily have very high levels of inflammation where they would see those benefits. So maybe for us healthy people, taking a supplement that would help with senescent cells or help with lowering inflammation, it maybe not doesn't have almost any effect. Maybe we don't know that. But I would say out of all the supplements out there, what I think would help with quote unquote slowing down the speed of biological aging, I would probably say something like AKG is quite interesting. I think there's animal data that it extends a lifespan. It targets multiple hallmarks of aging like stem cell exhaustion, inflammation, and genomic stability, and mitochondrial function, and many others. But it doesn't have a lot of like clinical data. There is one study from 2021 where they gave AKG for 6 months with vitamin D, and this biological age score declined by something like 7 years, I think, within 6 months of use. Now, that's not very like good evidence. At least they measured it, right? Whether or not the measurement is accurate is a different story, but they measured it, that it worked. There's animal data that it extended lifespan, and there's like mechanistic data as well that it interacts with these different hallmarks of aging. That would be like one that I would add to this list.
So addressing some of the hallmarks of aging, having data from clinical populations as well as non-human animals.
Mm-hmm.
And how about you, Nic?
I definitely see the appeal of addressing the hallmarks of aging. I think that's an interesting way to go. I like it, and I think it's a way to go. I think my way tends to be a lot broader in terms of the only thing I really care about is two things. One, does it affect multiple organ systems? Does it affect the functionality? So that's a layer above the hallmarks of aging, because the hallmarks of aging are going to contribute to the functionality of these organ systems. And the second thing is the effect size. So if the effect size is teeny tiny for many years, then I just don't worry about it. If the effect size is relatively modest, but it happens pretty quickly. And then I look at the population that it's studied in, it's people that are just kind of the average person, then yeah, that's great. It's kind of a toss-up. I just tell a person, this is the situation. You can consider if, based on your budget, is this something that you'd be interested in? You might get a little more interested if it's in a specific population of, athletes, for example, they get a pretty sizable boost in something in their performance, then obviously that would be something that they would want to seriously consider. So yeah, it's really based on those two things. Does it affect your organ systems, as in the functionality? And the second thing is the effect size. And I guess you could add a tertiary of the population that you're studying.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And seeing the study that you mentioned was the study by Brian Kennedy and co. And it was this retrospective analysis. The product in question is called Rejuven, and it is a multi-ingredient supplement. So it's not like we can chalk up those results to the 2 grams of calcium AKG in that particular product. And Brian Kennedy himself is very quick to point that out. He's an excellent scientist. So kudos to him for doing that work. And like you say, the fact that they are actually studying it and publishing that research and pointing out the limitations of it, I think is definitely a good thing. And then Nic, fully agree about the need to look at different organ systems, recognizing that these molecules are distributed unevenly. People often speak about targeting the hallmarks of aging, but they only look at a small subset of cells. When if you look at the transcriptional profiles of different cells, they're enormously divergent across tissues and so on. And then also effect size matters. It's easy just to look at a headline or an abstract or something and assume that because something is statistically significant, which often wouldn't be if it was adjusted for multiple testing, it's meaningful, but often it's not clinically meaningful. And Nic, I think you do a really good job in the content that you produce of pointing out the importance of effect sizes and when something does actually equate to something that's likely to affect someone's long-term disease risk and when that's not the case.
Thanks.
And then population is key because, as I alluded to, if you've got people who are quite sick at baseline, you're probably more likely to see a substantial effect size than if people are relatively healthy. Take the example of blood pressure. There are many things that lower blood pressure in people with hypertension, but because of floor effects, those same things probably would have no effect on the blood pressure of the 3 of us, for instance. Relevant to this is biological sex as well. One of the great things about the ITP is they study mice of both sexes, and they often find that a candidate geroprotector has a lifespan effect in one sex but not the other. And so when we look at these multi-ingredient products, I think it's advantageous to have a product that contains ingredients that have been shown to affect the lifespan or health span of each of the sexes. And then another key one is just safety. One of the frustrations of people like us who spend time looking at this research is that often people get stuck on safety or they disregard it entirely and they don't report all of the relevant outcomes which we need to know about. So it's as if the research ends up forking in one of 2 directions, where if you look at the research on senolytics like fisetin and quercetin and dasatinib, so much of that has just focused on safety outcomes. We're still getting these safety trials getting published several years later. Alternatively, people don't focus enough on safety or they don't publish their findings. And then we're left in the dark and we don't know what really is safe. So I think irrespective of what you're taking, having some information about the safety of those substances in humans is really important. And on the subject of safety, we also have sourcing, the form of the ingredients and so on. So I wonder if you could just speak to that and we can take an example. So take the example of a plant-based supplement. What are some things that you would factor in when trying to choose between different products that are available off the shelf?
If they have third-party testing, that's just a good sign. And I get one pitfall with any supplement is the proprietary blend that they won't disclose these specific ratios of specific ingredients or the amounts of specific ingredients. So they just hide it behind the proprietary blend for copyright reasons. But yeah, in that case, it's just not trustworthy.
Well, I don't know what else I would add to that. I think the only supplement that I think of that has a plant-based substitution, if you want to call it, versus what's been primarily studied is like omega-3s, because a lot of it they're looking at like DHEA and EPA. There's less studies that have been done looking at algal oil versus the fish oils. So, I mean, that's something to consider, but I usually just look at the breakdown. I mean, it's true that if you don't know the exact amounts that are included in the supplement, then to me that puts up a bunch of red flags. But if you do see the dosages and you see the breakdown in the molecules that are included, and even if you were to go back to one of my previous examples of lutein and zeaxanthin, you need to know that it's not disproportionately focused on one versus the other. There needs to be a balance, a ratio between the two. And that's true of EPA and DHA because those have slightly different effects on the body if it comes to cardiovascular risk or when it comes to brain health. And when you go into the subcellular mechanisms, they work slightly differently. So to me, yeah, focusing on just knowing which molecules to look at, making sure that it's appropriately dosed. And to Siim's point, if they're using a proprietary blend, to me that's a pretty big red flag.
Yes, it's hard to, for regular people to know if the supplement they buy actually has the ingredient that they claim they do, unless they have some independent testing or third-party testing on their website. Because even like some these very popular supplements like NMN, there's studies analysis done by the Trigonelline, where they look at the amounts of NMN in a lot of popular supplement brands in Amazon, and they find that like something like 15% actually have the real amount that they say on the label, and most of them just are underdosed or just completely zero from NMN. So yeah, for the average person, it's almost impossible to do they have to go start testing all these things themselves? So yeah, obviously not. So it's kind of a challenging situation, but just trying to find reputable brands that have that are with long history and they've been scrutinized enough and they've had testing done.
Third-party testing does matter, and I think it matters for slightly different reasons than it used to matter, because there was a time when contamination with performance-enhancing drugs was a real issue, particularly in the bodybuilding supplement world. And there were things like deaths due to consumption of certain products on the market. There was a fat burner named hydroxycut that at least one person died from back in the day, if I recall correctly. I think there's less of that now, but certainly what's in the product often doesn't match what's on the label. And there have been studies looking at various different supplements. Siim, I know on your podcast we've spoken about melatonin previously as another example of that. But now there are reasons to have concerns about other contaminants potentially. A few days ago, I saw a paper published last year looking at micro and nanoplastic contamination, dietary fiber supplements. All of the products that they looked at contained plastics, which was interesting, and the powders were more egregious than the gummy products that they looked at. And so maybe the things that we need to be concerned about are shifting a bit over time. But these third-party testing companies like Informed Sport or websites like Consumer Lab can be helpful. Nic, my question about plant extracts was more about supplements that are isolated from plants and then issues related to that, like the standardization of those. So if you take an example like ashwagandha, then there are products on the market like Nuganda, KSM66, and others that are standardized for bioactives. Or if you take the example of rhodiola rosea, SHR5 is standardized for rosifins and salidroside. The list goes on. And because those are routinely used in research, we know more about their effects than other products that don't have those names and they might in those studies tell you that there is a certain concentration of the bioactive and it was tested, that you don't know the specific product and therefore you can't source that product yourself necessarily. The specifics of the plant extracts often do matter a lot, more so for some products than others. I think this is especially true of curcumin products, because if you just take turmeric and compare it to something like Longvida, or I think the most bioavailable last time I checked was BioKirk. It was over 400 times more bioavailable than the curcumin from turmeric alone. And clearly that has huge implications for what dose might be appropriate as well. And then regarding vitamins and minerals, sometimes the specific thing that the micronutrient in question is bound to matters too. So take the example of magnesium. Magnesium oxide, as I mentioned, can have quite potent laxative effects, which can be helpful. I'd rather you take magnesium oxide as a laxative than some of the things that you might buy from your pharmacy, because at least with magnesium, you're potentially getting some small positive effects from the magnesium itself. But whereas oxide might be quite a potent laxative, other forms like magnesium citrate or glycinate aren't necessarily the same. And then what the magnesium is bound to will also influence things like its tissue distribution and so on as well. So the forms do matter. And then another interesting subject, at least to me, is when you take the products, and we can think of this across different timescales, when you take them within your day and when you take them within your lifespan. So I wonder if you could share some thoughts related to that.
I take like most of my supplements in the morning. There's a few exceptions that you want to take in the evening, like melatonin or glycine you can take throughout the day. Some other like ashwagandha you can also take in the evening for stress management, for example. Yeah, I personally like take most of them like in the morning as a like just with my food or some sort of a protein shake.
Do you have any opinions on like the over lifespan, like when a person should take?
Yeah, I mean, like we said, creatine is one of the best ones for older people. I think every elderly people would benefit from creatine. And when you're young, you're less likely to be at a risk of low creatine intake. Like if you're young, you probably eat more calories and more, animal products that provide creatine. Whereas older people, they're just, one of the problems with the elderly people is that they just don't eat enough. It's called like the anorexia of aging, that their appetite decreases and their ability to chew food decreases. So, older people, they're not going to chew a lot of a steak to get to the creatine. So that's why they're one of the best candidates for creatine as supplementation, besides just the health benefits overall. And I think that a few other supplements are like that benefit more elderly people than younger people. Like anything related to like improving metabolic health and lipids and blood pressure and blood sugar, like young people probably benefit much less from. Like if you're 20 years old or 30 years old, then you probably don't need berberine to maintain metabolic health and adequate insulin sensitivity, unless you are overweight or poor lifestyle. But a generally average healthy 20 to 30-year-old doesn't really need it, or they wouldn't notice like a huge benefit. But if you're 60, 70, 80, then just by default, because of the process of aging and not being able to exercise that much and etc., you'll have worse glucose regulation and worse lipid metabolism. So something like berberine might be useful as just like a way to manage the blood work with a pill.
Yeah, that's a great point. I completely agree. I think the vast majority of, or to address the longevity aspect or the over lifespan effect, I think the vast majority of supplements are probably useful for people at the very least in their 40s and beyond, but likely older than that. There's only, I think, a few supplements that I think are really of any use for anybody in their 20s and 30s. And the framework that I would offer people is to have the first question you should ask yourself is, what is the outcome that you're hoping for? What's the use case for this supplement? So if you're hoping to just, guzzle a bunch of supplements just because you've heard that it's good for X or Y or Z, there's a lot of questions that are kind of sub questions that come under that a person needs to ask themselves. If you look at yourself and you're 28 years old and you have, let's say, infinite money to be able to buy all the supplements that you've heard of, the answer would probably be you still probably shouldn't buy any of them because they won't do anything for you. But if you're maybe 68 years old and maybe you have prediabetes, then now you can start to really introduce a lot of these different supplements. Another thing we were talking about ashwagandha a little bit, rhodiola rosea. If you're not necessarily looking at lifespan, or if you're not necessarily looking at specific health markers, but maybe you're really stressed or you're really anxious, in those situations, those would be supplements that might be beneficial for somebody who's in their 20s. Let's say you're 22, you're finishing college, you're in your final semester, you're very stressed out because you have all these exams and whatnot. In that case, then supplements could be a benefit that so you don't have to necessarily go to a doctor to get a, I don't know, Xanax prescription or whatever it might be. I mean, it's very much going to depend on your conversation with a physician, but and it just depends on the use case. Now, in terms of the timing within the day, again, it just goes back to that same fundamental question of why are you taking the supplement? What's the ultimate goal that you're trying to achieve? And if it's, for example, sleep, to Siim's point, you can take it later in the day. And if you wanted to take it specifically for sleep, that was your main outcome, then yeah, you would take it just like a lot of studies indicate, which would be like 30 minutes, an hour before sleep. And you would dose it appropriately for that. On the other hand, if you're taking it for the potential longevity benefit, then it may not matter as much in terms of exactly when you take it. And then it's just based on convenience. So then it comes down to, well, what's sustainable? Do you always forget to take your supplements at night? Then take it in the morning when you can easily remember, things like that. So it's really, it's a lot more conservative approach to supplementation than I think, again, I just keep talking about social media because it's just rampant, but that's just how I think about it.
So I think there's a lot of pretty helpful advice in there. Within the day, Siim, you spoke about you take most things in the morning. Being pragmatic, most people are only going to remember to take supplements once a day. And so if that's the case, then taking them all in the morning might make sense. In an ideal world, we'd also be thinking about whether the supplements interact with the circadian clock and clock-regulated processes. This is obviously the case for sleep supplements taken late in the day and supplements with stimulant effects, which you typically take early in the day. But it's likely that many supplements do interact with the circadian clock. And some of the more interesting geroprotectors probably do as well. And there are a few that haven't reached clinical trials yet that I'm really intrigued by, curious to see where the research goes in years to come. How the supplements interact with the food that you consume, I think, is a really important point. So take the example of someone who's trying to boost their iron status. They've got a history of insufficient iron intakes and then iron deficiency anemia. If they're taking their iron supplement in the morning with 3 cups of tea, then the tannins in the tea are going to interfere with the absorption of the iron. And so we need to consider that. In the context of geroprotectors, I think one of the more intriguing interactions might be with energy availability, because some of the candidates that are out there seem to in some ways mimic calorie restriction. And so if you're on a calorie restricted diet already, my guess is that taking a calorie restriction mimetic would have smaller effects in those circumstances. Within the lifespan, one of the subjects that I discussed recently on the podcast that I did with Stephen Ostad is antagonistic pleiotropy, the idea that what's good for you early in life might not be good for you late in life. And based on the biology of that, there are reasons to think that if you take some of these geroprotective supplements early in life, they could potentially interfere with your reproductive function. And there's a little bit of evidence in that direction with a few of them. So many of the more potent anti-aging supplements might be best saved for later in life, as you guys spoke about too. That's probably especially true of some supplements targeting specific processes. So going back to the hallmarks of aging, there are certain hallmarks that aren't particularly relevant early in life, like the accumulation of senescent cells. Unless you've got some sort of fibrotic disease, you probably don't have a big burden of senescent cells, potentially in any of your tissues. And so taking a senolytic is probably not smart, in part because it seems likely that there's been an evolutionary trade-off between cellular senescence and risk of cancer. That's probably also true of telomere attrition. So it might be that we've evolved such that we have loss of the length of those telomeres and accumulation of senescent cells, in part because those both actually help protect us against the development of cancer. And if we take geroprotective supplements that are aggressively targeting those hallmarks of aging, then that could dispose us to those cancers. And that hasn't been shown clinically yet, but hypothetically it makes some sense. So I think there is a category of geroprotectors that really should be saved for late in life. And into that category, I'd put things like senolytics. I think glyNAC is an interesting one that we'll come to later, just in part because there has been research suggesting that it's potentially helpful for people later in life, probably in part because of chronic inflammation, whereas early in life, any effects are much smaller.
With the senolytics, like the senescent cells are also involved in wound healing. So like if you take senolytics, are you like impairing your wound healing in some sense? That not been shown yet, but another possible risk.
Yeah, and they're even involved in growth and development, I believe. And then regarding interactions, there are lots of these. So age being one of those interactions. I think how these different molecules interact with genetics is relevant in some contexts. So that's been quite well shown for melatonin. There's a common polymorphism in one of the genes that encodes one of the melatonin receptors. The gene is MTNR1B, that produces a gain of function phenotype, which basically means that it amplifies the effects of melatonin on certain outcomes, like blood sugar control. And so people who carry that common polymorphism will have more exaggerated blood sugar swings after taking melatonin than people who don't carry it. That's not to say those people shouldn't be taking melatonin, but it does mean that potentially they should be more cognizant of things like when they're eating relative to taking certain supplements. Again, this is minutiae, but it is interesting, and I think it all points in the direction of personalization. How some supplements interact with medications, I think, is a big one. For some supplements, at least. Certainly it's true of things like piperine, which affects the metabolism of lots of different drugs because it acts on one of the enzymes that are involved in xenobiotic detoxification. And so basically, if you took piperine shortly before taking certain medications, then the medication's concentration in your blood would have a much bigger area under the curve than had you not taken the piperine before taking them. How the supplements interact with other supplements as well. So Nic, you spoke about lutein and zeaxanthin. That's an interesting one just because they probably selectively affect the health of different parts of the retina. But I've already touched on a couple of these, like vitamin D3 and K2 and how those influence calcium deposition. How they interact with other aspects of lifestyle. So we spoke about vitamin D and sun exposure. Probably relevant to a few other things, to light exposure, potentially one of those being melatonin, and then maybe some other lifestyle factors. So smoking is an interesting one. Oral contraception would be an interesting one too, just because smoking, if we take that example, does seem to affect the metabolism of certain supplements. Staying on the subject of lifestyle factors, one that has received some attention is how they interact with exercise, because some of the stronger candidates might hamper some of the ways in which we respond to exercise. Siim, I'll pass this one over to you first.
I like the antioxidants, vitamin C and NAC, taken after resistance training might blunt some of the hypertrophy signal and benefits from exercise. And I've seen actually with melatonin as well, that taking melatonin after you've resistance trained could have like some also like this inhibitory, because inflammation is one of the signals for the muscle growth. And if you blunt that with even like NSAIDs, aspirin, or something like that, then I think you'll still make some gains, but probably not some diminished effect.
Nic, have you got anything to add?
I'm silent because I have no idea what to add.
Something like berberine could also be maybe, because berberine would suppress the mTOR pathway. I haven't seen any evidence in humans that it would reduce muscle hypertrophy signal or reduce gains from strength training, but at least mechanistically, so it does suppress mTOR, which is the growth pathway that gets activated during exercise.
Some of that literature, like on the vitamin C or antioxidants and whatnot, I haven't looked into it too in depth, but I remember there's this one influential paper where they had people exercise and then gave them a bunch of, I guess it was vitamin C and something else, maybe vitamin
C and E, I think.
C and E, yeah. And they showed reductions in, I guess, reactive oxygen species and then some signaling markers and whatnot. I'm always curious, though, if, and maybe you guys could probably answer this better than I could, but have we seen any actual outcome measurements of, reduced hypertrophy or reduced VO2, like Siim mentioned with metformin, some negative effects, which I have seen those outcome data. But for some of these other papers, it seems like we're focusing a lot on the signaling, which to me makes a lot of sense, but it's just kind of like that first step of okay, maybe we shouldn't do this. But I guess I'm not aware of studies that have actually looked at the functional outcomes. Do you guys know of any?
Yeah, there have been a few.
Okay.
And this body of research actually goes back a while. I remember during my master's degree, 2013, 2014, reading some of Michael Ristow's early work looking at vitamin C and E supplementation around the time of exercise, finding some blunted adaptations. And since then, there has been additional work looking at relevant outcomes too. So some measures of metabolic health, like blood sugar control, as well as some adaptations to training, like changes in cardiorespiratory fitness, so VO2 max or VO2 peak, finding some negative effects. In the context of geroprotectors, it's probably been best shown for metformin. So far, there have been several studies. Some of the early work showed reduced improvements in insulin sensitivity and VO2 max when people took metformin alongside structured endurance training. And then other work showed blunted muscle hypertrophy, but not statistically significant blunted strength gains. I might be misremembering some of the specifics, but that is my vague recollection. And then I think mechanistically, we could extrapolate from that berberine could have some negative effects, because it does seem to act quite similarly to metformin in many ways, in terms of complex 1 inhibition and in terms of AMPK activation and deregulated nutrient sensing, which is kind of a clunky way of putting it, being one of the hallmarks of aging. Many of these different things that do target that, like rapamycin targeting mTOR, it'll be interesting to see whether that holds true for those as well. But in the case of rapamycin, the jury is still out because, and this is just the hypothesis, but I wonder if there's going to be a discordance between what we see in people who aren't doing exercise and what we see in people who are doing exercise. So if you look at the Pearl trial of rapamycin that was published, and we can't really make too much of that because of limitations of the study and because of the things that they looked at, there was very, very tentative evidence suggesting that people who took rapamycin had marginally better body composition after taking it, but that wasn't in conjunction with exercise training. And you can imagine a situation in which someone takes metformin, not doing exercise training. Metformin typically results in a very small amount of body weight loss. So they might lose a little bit of fat mass too, and you might therefore assume, metformin's improving body composition. However, we know that metformin, if anything, seems likely to slightly impair some of those adaptations to exercise. So it could be that similarly, rapamycin taken by sedentary people has negligible effects on body composition or even marginally positive ones. But could it be that at the same time, another group of people who are doing exercise alongside taking it have worse outcomes in terms of their fitness gains than people who aren't taking it or are taking a placebo?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, with rapamycin, like mechanistically, we think that it would result in muscle loss because of inhibition of mTOR. But yeah, like some of the research shows the opposite, that it doesn't make people lose muscle, but they actually maintain it, like protecting against sarcopenia slightly.
That goes back to the population studied, though, right? Because a lot of the rapamycin, I mean, other than the immune modulatory studies that have been done for transplants, rapamycin has usually been studied in people that are at least in, I guess, their 50s and beyond. My understanding is that with rapamycin, they believe that it'll decrease mTOR overactivity so that you can get a bit of a sensitizing effect for mTOR. But I don't know if that would necessarily be the case for like younger individuals, right? That have highly sensitive mTOR, don't have dysregulation or anything of that nature. I don't know. How do you guys think about rapamycin in that regard?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the mTOR sensitization may be one of the mechanisms, because diabetics also have mTOR hyperactivity because of the high blood sugar. But diabetics aren't jacked, so it's maybe something to do with the hyperactivity of mTOR or desensitization, similar to insulin. Like insulin can be a very powerful anabolic hormone. Bodybuilders inject it to build muscle, but at the same time, people who with insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia, they have a whole host of problems.
Yeah, I think one of your points earlier too is a really good one about when like for muscle growth, for example, that there is usually this inflammatory response that comes in and is a factor when it comes to muscle growth. And I think something that often people forget about is that we get so hyper focused on like mTOR, for example, the activity of mTOR, like, oh, mTOR's upregulated, we might have greater protein synthesis and whatnot, but there's so many other factors that have to come in. You have to have chaperone proteins, you have to have targeting sequences, you have to have all these different aspects that lead the protein to be sent to the correct spots, to be integrated correctly. And I think all of that happens through the actual exercise cascade. So to your point, Siim, about if you're looking at like, I don't know, diabetic individuals, like type 2 diabetics that are far along and they're injecting insulin, for example, insulin is a very potent hormone and it's an anabolic. Like you said, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to end up jacked. And I think that's because we focus so much on the mechanisms and we don't focus enough on what's the overall, like what is actually causing this transduction of the entire pathway to specifically target muscle growth or specifically target aerobic activity or whatever it might be. So yeah, it's just that's why I was asking about the vitamin C and vitamin E, because I wasn't aware of the research actually indicating the functional effects. But I mean, like you guys said, if there are studies, then there are studies, and I'm going to be super interested to read those, because I've always had that question. I've been asked that question a few times, and I just haven't had a reasonable response.
With the antioxidants, it's interesting that even in the randomized controlled trials, people who take vitamin C, or was it like beta carotene and vitamin A, I think were the ones that their intake was actually also seen with higher mortality. Vitamin C, I think, was like not, but beta carotene, which is an antioxidant as well, and vitamin A, their use was seen to increase the risk of all-cause mortality. I wonder what's the like reason there. It's kind of interesting.
I think that when people are taking certain things relative to exercise is going to prove really important. So from my perspective, if I was taking rapamycin, I wouldn't be taking it on days that I'm doing resistance training. Likewise, if I was in my 50s and I was thinking, I'm just getting to the point where I think I might benefit from taking glyNAC, I'd probably take it on days off exercise. There's a little bit of evidence suggesting that NAC, one of the components of glyNAC, N-acetylcysteine, could also, because of its antioxidant properties, blunt some of those responses. And likewise for metformin, if someone is doing exercise that's going to improve their blood sugar control on the days that they are exercising, and the main reason they're taking metformin is to improve their glycemic control, then they could just take that on their non-training days, at least initially, and tinker with that accordingly. Probably also some considerations that are more acute than that. So whether you're taking something before exercise, whether you're taking it after exercise, and how that interacts with when you're training during the day. It could be that if you have to take it on the same day, then you want to take it as far from exercise as possible, assuming it's not going to have some substantial effect on your sleep-wake cycle. So I think it's another instance in which timing is going to prove really important. And just returning to what you were discussing earlier, I think we've got to bear in mind tissue specificity. We need enough growth signaling in certain tissues to retain the mass and function of those tissues over time. It's true of the brain, it's true of skeletal muscle. And it's difficult to understand all of the complexities of that in different tissues. It might be that just because something on paper is an mTOR complex 1 inhibitor, we can't assume that it's having that effect in all tissues at the same time. And really what it's doing is it's improving the fidelity of the signal in that pathway in certain tissues, but not in other tissues. Nic, have you got anything to add there? You look pensive.
Yeah. Any discussion of science ends up being pensive. I think it just goes back to these different molecules that have effects on these different, like let's say the brain or the musculature, or the bone and whatnot. I really think that the age effect is something that people just don't highlight enough. You guys do, but I think in general, we don't highlight it enough because we think about mTOR and these signaling pathways as just doing this one thing. It just promotes growth, and it's good or it's bad. And I think that as aging occurs, and what I've seen in the literature from a lot of different studies, if that's rapamycin or if that's some of the clotho research, I'm focusing on the brain right now, in that literature, it seems to me that oftentimes you want to diminish mTOR activity because the overactivity of mTOR is leading to the production of these aberrant proteins. You're essentially making so much of these proteins that are being mislocalized, or just the targeting of the signal just gets scrambled in some way, which I don't have the granularity. I haven't done enough research into it to describe exactly how, but it just seems to me like we focus on mTOR in terms of like musculature or whatever, and it is generally considered that if you increase mTOR activity, that you see an increase in protein synthesis, and then the hope is that you then see muscle growth. But I just don't think that it's always should be considered for anybody listening. I'm not really talking to you guys, but just for anybody listening, it just shouldn't always be considered as, well, this is good or this is bad. It is very tissue specific, like you said, Greg, but it also matters on the context of the person that you're talking about, their age. I think their age is just such a massive modulating factor. Also their health, if they're going through mild cognitive impairment and they're on their way towards some sort of dementia, or if they're perfectly healthy and they're just trying to improve their insulin sensitivity or whatever it might be. There's a lot of different considerations that need to be taken into account. And that's where this whole aspect of understanding the population that you're talking about is extremely important before we, jump on these bandwagons of, a particular signaling cascade is always good or always bad. It's just a nuance that I don't think gets brought up enough in general.
Let's start to focus on a few specific supplements, and we'll begin with popular choice, which is the category of NAD precursors. There are lots of these that we could include. The most popular are NR, nicotinamide riboside, NMN, nicotinamide mononucleotide, or just straight nicotinamide. What do you guys think about these? And I wonder if one of you could just begin by explaining what the basic rationale is behind taking these supplements. Why are people doing this?
I guess the big reason is because NAD had been hyped up to be like a very important thing for longevity and aging, which, to a certain extent it is. Like NAD is pretty essential for life and living, and there is some evidence that NAD levels decline in some tissues with age. The reason it got popular is because you take the pill that raises your NAD and then you're maintaining it for longer. I guess there is the biggest evidence that they do work in raising NAD levels. That's been consistently shown that pretty much all of the precursors, niacin, niacinamide, NR, NMN, they all do raise NAD levels almost like a dose-dependent manner. At least NMN and NR do. But I guess with the clinical trials, the results have been a bit more disappointing. Like, there haven't been such groundbreaking results from these studies. Granted, there are not that many of them, but the ones that are out there, they're not like super impressive as of now. Nic, what do you think?
Yeah, you described it well. So I guess the way people are thinking about it, as you mentioned, that you see this increase in NAD, and NAD is involved in so many hundreds of different biochemical reactions within the cells, and therefore then you're seeing this profound effect on like mitochondrial health and DNA methylation and all this stuff. However, what's interesting is that then we get caught in this like rock in a hard place, because a lot of the clinical trials, like you mentioned, Siim, have been really disappointing. And I think one of the main reasons is because they're testing stuff that is not actually the proposed mechanism by which NMN and all these other precursors are supposed to affect. So yeah, we're in this position of like, okay, well, we have this hypothesis that boosting NAD inside the cells is going to have this widespread effect on all these different biochemical markers, and therefore that'll translate to some positive health and functional outcomes. However, that just doesn't seem to be the thing that we're testing. What we're testing is like LDL and triglycerides and things of that nature, and I don't know if we would actually see a translation to those types of markers. There have been a few studies that have looked at some functional markers like sit-to-stand test in people that are maybe in their 70s and whatnot. Again, relatively disappointing results in that regard. You also have people like Dr. David Sinclair, who obviously is one of the people that really made this extremely popular. He's been published on a study. That study, I gotta be honest with you, was just the statistics behind it and the way they displayed the data was just funny. And they looked at, a lot of the same metrics that everybody else has looked at. I think they looked at a few functional metrics and they showed some small improvements. But the small improvements, if you look at the way that they displayed it, I'm not going to go into too much detail with it. It's just not the way that I would have shown the data if I wanted to show. Because if you compare it to the placebo, ultimately you end up kind of coming to the conclusion that, okay, there isn't actually that much of a difference. So yeah, it's just across like 12, 13 studies, the clinical studies that I've looked at, really disappointing results. There's been a few small signals here and there, but by and large, I think that it's just been pretty bad overall. But again, as a final point, I just need to remind everyone that, a lot of the hypotheses were based around, the effects that it might have on like DNA damage, for example. By the way, there is one study that looked at DNA damage and they found no effect in humans. Just a single metric, though, single measure. So, I'd be open to it having an effect, but so far the evidence strongly points, even if maybe slightly off kilter to what it's supposed to be pointed at, seems to indicate that there's no real effect, at least in humans.
I like the fact that you emphasised that there was a single marker of DNA damage, because like many things, it's not that easy to measure proxies of DNA damage in people. I haven't read the study that you mentioned, David Sinclair's study. Can't say that I'm terribly surprised, going by David's rich reputation. And I do think that these supplements mechanistically make sense. NAD is really important. It helps shuttle electrons within cells in ways that support energy production. It has some non-redox effects too, so it's a cofactor for loads of enzymes involved in things like DNA repair. And so on paper, it's great, but as you guys are saying, the clinical research just hasn't really panned out, and neither is the preclinical research, because there have been a few lifespan experiments, and NR failed in the ITP to extend lifespan. I think there are probably lots of factors at play here. One is that they do raise NAD levels, but in some tissues and in some people's responses are very heterogeneous. And so I wonder if that's a contributing factor. Many of the clinical trials are also quite frustrating. They tend to look at NAD concentrations in certain tissues, predictably, often blood. They almost always look at some inflammatory markers in the blood. And then, like many supplements, it seems that some of the other outcomes that we might be more interested in, things like blood pressure and so on, respond most positively in people with the worst measures at baseline. There's also a question of alternative ways of raising NAD. And Nic, I know that you published a video, which I thought was very thoughtful, about the Nuchido Time product and the study that Nicola Conlon and her colleagues did on that. So I wonder if you could explain to us something about how people are approaching other ways to boost NAD and whether these alternative pathways seem efficacious based on what we know so far.
Yeah, so what they're trying to do here is they're using the salvage pathway to increase NAD, but instead of just inputting more of these NAD precursors, what they're doing is they're trying to target some of the enzymes around NAD and try to reduce the activity of certain enzymes and increase the activity of other enzymes that ultimately would lead to an increase in the pool. I think the idea is really clever, because it's possible that, we've just been inputting all these precursors and they just get siphoned off by these enzymes. Maybe the enzymes become more active and end up eliminating a lot of the NAD. So they talk about like CD38, NNMT, and NAMT. Yeah, so these different enzymes that they end up, addressing through like parsley extract, rutin, EGCG, and things of that nature, as well as, of course, an nicotinamide to increase NAD. So they did this through a randomized controlled trial. They looked at blood NAD levels, and then they looked at these different enzymes to see if there was greater levels of these enzymes or reduced levels based off of what they wanted to see. And they showed that, for example, like SIRT1, which is one of the enzymes that's supposed to be using this NAD, was increased after 28 days, and actually before those 28 days when this substance, the stack, I guess you can say, was applied to individuals, and in the placebo, they didn't see that effect. They also saw that with one other enzyme that they were trying to target, but they didn't find that in certain other enzymes. They also looked at some inflammatory markers and showed a very slight decrease in certain inflammatory markers. And then they looked at biological age change, as well as glycated serum protein, which I think fed into this biological age change. So overall, when you look at the study, the effects are really mild, which of course could come down to the fact that they only did it for 28 days, which is completely fair. But they also didn't, I hate to say it, but they also didn't use the right statistics in a lot of their measurements. And considering the effect was just right on the cusp almost every single time, it to me, it raises this massive question of like, well, if they just done the right statistics, would they, like, for example, for multiple measurements, they use paired t-tests, which, and then for some of the other measurements where they did use the right statistics, the effect was just so tiny. So going back to this question that I always have of effect size, it just doesn't seem that impressive. So that's what I took away from it. But I will say, just to their credit, I really love their approach to this. And maybe if they just tweak it, that they can get to some real effects, which would be really, really cool.
And they're one of the main, NAD boosters in there is the nicotinamide. Plus they have like other things like green tea extract, I think apigenin as well. So there are different pathways that support the same salvage pathway. Apigenin inhibits the CD38, which is one of the main consumers of NAD that increases with age. It's like inflammatory glycoprotein. And then you have the green tea extract that activates AMPK, which supports the salvage pathway enzyme NAMPT. So yeah, you have like different pathways or targets for the different enzyme.
Yeah, that type of systems biology approach is really interesting. A few things that I'll highlight. One is that going by their data, and I'm not sure how much we can make of those data if I'm being frank, the size of the NAD boost was comparable to what's been reported in studies on NR and NMN so far. If anything, it was probably slightly lower than the average. Although we need to bear in mind that if you look at those studies on NR and NMN, they often use high doses. You buy True Niagen, the standard dose that you'll get is 300 milligrams, although they've got another product which is 1,000 milligrams. But most of the studies are around the 1,000 milligram mark, which works out as being tremendously expensive. And I'd say to the point of being exclusive for most people. The statistics point is well made. I think it's true of a lot of research across the board. It's true of research in this sector too. One of the more egregious examples was a study that I read recently, which was the widely discussed, highly publicized metformin study that looked at a certain type of macaque. They just measured everything under the sun, everything that you could possibly think of measuring in every tissue, in every cell, and they didn't correct for multiple testing.
Mm-hmm.
I just sat there reading it thinking, are you kidding? How has this been published in this prestigious journal? But actually that's symptomatic of a bigger problem with that journal. So that is something that people need to consider, that unless they're scientifically trained, frankly, they're likely to miss, or unless they're statistically trained, they're likely to miss.
When you can, let's say you run across a study and they use the wrong statistics. Let's say they use a t-test when there's 3 comparisons or 4 comparisons or something along those lines. At what point do you dismiss the study, and at what point do you say, okay, even though they use the t-test, do you maybe look at the effect size and say, well, it's a 50% difference, so it probably doesn't matter which test that they would have used. Does that run across your mind, or you just dismiss the study entirely, or how do you think about that?
I wouldn't just dismiss it entirely necessarily. I wouldn't necessarily then go and calculate an effect size. That is something that you can do with sufficient data, but I wouldn't pull out my calculator. And instead, I'd try and make sense of the entirety of the results. And I'd be looking at those graphs to look at changes in the respective groups. So hopefully there's a placebo group and an experimental group. But really, that is a question of sticking your finger in the air. It's not a very scientific way to approach things. And so my confidence in my interpretation of results from those studies is very low. And my confidence in that particular supplement is correspondingly low because of that publication. But once more, kudos to them for actually publishing the research and for trying to understand what the supplement is doing. And I think they're also somewhat hamstrung by some circumstantial issues. I vaguely recall that COVID might have thrown a spanner in the works, as has been true of a lot of research over the last few years. So regardless, I think we should tip our hats to them for doing that work. I just wouldn't recommend that product as an alternative way to boost NAD over NR or NMN. This brings us to where I was going, which is alternative ways that people have tried or that people are just starting to experiment with. Early on, there was a lot of research in resveratrol, polyphenol that's found in abundance in certain plants, famously red grapes. People spoke about it as being the source of the French paradox, the idea that French people have good health despite their high consumption of red wine, and maybe it's this miracle polyphenol that's found in red grapes. And David Sinclair, sure enough, made a fortune based on this idea when he sold a company that was basically making spin-offs of resveratrol to GSK for hundreds of millions of dollars. That went under several years later, but I don't want to get too distracted by that. Resveratrol has continued to be studied, and it gets slammed by a lot of people in this world. But do you guys think that it has any application in geroscience or in trying to help people allay aging?
I'll defer to Siim on this one because I've actually not done very much research on resveratrol at all.
Yeah, so the story is very interesting. That it started in the late 90s already, and very famous people were involved in the research, like Matt Caberlane and Brian Kennedy and Gerald Leonardo or something.
Lenny Guarente, I think.
Yeah, Guarente, yeah, and David Sinclair. They were all working on that, sirtuins and lifespan and resveratrol. In 2004 was one of the studies where they first found to extend lifespan. But the subsequent follow-up studies didn't find those effects. And the GSK that bought the Sirtuis company, that was David Sinclair's company, they stopped researching resveratrol after a few years after they bought it. So the lifespan data is definitely very murky and not really repeated. With human data, you have some, there is one I guess condition where they've found extension in lifespan was when they fed like these mice 60% coconut oil diet and they got super obese, and resveratrol enabled them to live a bit longer. So it's not like the resveratrol has, again, pro-lifespan effects in otherwise healthy people. It's just if you're super obese, then it might mitigate some of the harm, so you survive for a bit longer.
Is that like the diet that mice have in the Caribbean? Is coconut a mainstay of the Caribbean mouse diet?
Yeah, it's just super obesogenic. I don't think mice aren't supposed to eat coconut oil. So, and there's actually in humans there is some clinical trials that in diabetics and overweight people, resveratrol does have some benefits on lipids and blood sugar and those things. So it may be some like parallel effect that you see from the mouse data from obesogenic mice, but otherwise it doesn't really have any health effects on otherwise healthy people, and potentially has harm for, in humans there's like androgens. In older men it's been seen to decrease androgens, not testosterone but androgens, and possibly like VO2 max and other exercise benefits as well, similar to like the antioxidants.
I haven't seen that research, but my impression, similar to yours, is that it does have some modest positive effects in some populations. We see that with blood pressure, blood sugar control, and a couple of other things. And people have thrown it under the bus, completely understandably, given the backstory. But I'd be really curious to see someone compare equivalent doses of resveratrol and NR head to head, and see how the groups do relative to placebo.
Yeah, with the VO2 max, it blunts some of the benefits. So it does. Okay. So if you exercise, you will still see an increase in VO2 max, but it's smaller than if you're not taking resveratrol.
Yeah, it's a common theme.
Blunts some of the benefits.
What about pterostilbene? I think it might be that if you haven't got to resveratrol, then you haven't got to pterostilbene either. But Siim, have you got any thoughts?
So there is no animal data about lifespan that I've seen, and there's not many clinical trials either. The only, I guess, downside to that is that it raises LDL cholesterol, unless you're combining it with grape extract. There was a study that found that the pterostilbene alone raised the LDL, but if you took it with grape extract, then it didn't. And there's no other studies that I've actually seen.
I think there's a single study looking at isolated pterostilbene supplementation so far, and it's just a safety study of 100 milligrams. So we can't extrapolate much from that. Pterostilbene is an ingredient in one of the Elysium NAD boosters, and they have published a few studies on that, but that's in conjunction with an NAD precursor. So you can't tell much about the effects of pterostilbene per se based on those analyses. And then there are potentially a couple of other ways of boosting NAD. If we put aside the systems biology approach where we're trying to also reduce the activity of some of these enzymes that are chewing up NAD, one of these that I only came across relatively recently is Trigonelline, which is in coffee. Have you guys come across that?
No, I'm not.
It's quite interesting just because it's in coffee in quite high quantities. It's basically methylated niacin. And there has been some work now in other animals showing that it consistently boosts NAD. One of the interesting things is that it does so in skeletal muscle. NR and NMN don't do that. They do so in blood, and they might do so in the brain, which is encouraging because I think that could have some clinical relevance to certain populations, in particular people experiencing some neurodegenerative conditions, but they don't affect skeletal muscle NAD substantially. Trigonelline does seem to, which is intriguing. Maybe a combination of these different precursors could have some additive effects, or maybe Trigonelline in isolation will prove more efficacious than NR or NMN or nicotinamide. Another that we'll come back to later is ergothioneine, which is acting through a very different mechanism, but does seem to substantially boost NAD. And I suspect that the effects of that on different tissue compartments will be more widespread because cells in lots of different tissues seem to love ergothioneine and readily and greedily take it up. Before we get there, this isn't a subject that I'm going to chime in with my thoughts on just because I've addressed it previously in a podcast that I did with Rebecca Strawbridge. So if people are interested, then they can tune into that. But people in the YouTube world have woken up to the potential merits of lithium in the last few months in particular. You got any brief thoughts on lithium as the geroprotector?
We've discussed it in the past. I'm a fan of the microdosing lithium. I've only looked at it in relation to cognitive health, if I remember correctly. So looking at cognitive decline, and there's some pretty impressive small clinical trials that have looked at lithium, and at the very least delaying, but at least over the course of the study, which don't ask me how long the study was, because although that is very important, seems to completely stop the regression or the continuation, I suppose I should say, of mild cognitive impairment, which that alone is really impressive. I'd like to see that kind of done over longer periods of time because mild cognitive impairment is not something that just appears and gets worse day after day. It tends to happen over many months, many years. But so far, I think the evidence is pretty good. I'd like to do some more research on that because it's definitely a fascinating molecule.
Yeah, I agree. Like the brain, I think the biggest benefits are for the brain. The evidence suggests, but there's some of these observational studies that even like the areas where they have more lithium in the drinking water, they have lower suicide, lower homicide, and greater life expectancy. And the theory is then like, is it the lithium that has some of those effects? Maybe like mental health, like traditionally it's used for bipolar disorder, right? And mania, manic episodes. and the microdose lithium might have like some mental health and mental stability benefits, which goes into homicide and suicide area. But yeah, obviously it's not a very controlled experiment in that scenario. But looking at the mechanistics, then yeah, the brain benefits are quite interesting. There's some mouse study as well that lithium like inhibits some of these like Alzheimer's related proteins or tau tangles as well, which is very early to say anything about that, but definitely does something to the brain.
Can't think of a way to smoothly transition to the subject, but AKG came up earlier, and AKG is a Krebs cycle intermediate, which is quite biologically promiscuous. It's involved in lots of different things, it seems. And in the last few years, people have started adding it to supplements for a few reasons, I think. One of them has been the publication of some studies on rodents showing potential effects on certainly health span, potentially lifespan too, and then also the retrospective analysis of Rejuven that we discussed earlier. What do you think about AKG as a candidate? And do you have any idea how it's acting?
I haven't looked into it a whole lot, so I think, as far as I know, Siim, you've looked into it a little bit more than I have, but AKG, I mean, the way I think about it is if it does have an effect, because it's so mitochondria-centric, it would probably, to me, make more sense to address any sort of mitochondrial dysfunction than it would be to specifically target AKG. But again, that's coming from a pretty naive standpoint at this point.
Yeah, I recently actually wrote a chapter for my next book on AKG. So it's like a book on supplements, and AKG is one of the ingredients. Yeah, like the biggest reason why you see some of like the health benefits in animal studies is probably with energy production and the Krebs cycle. And AKG is also involved in like some other metabolic functions like protein metabolism and even like collagen synthesis and those things. But human studies, there's very little. I mentioned the biological age study, but that's not very practical. They didn't look at like functional outcomes like grip strength or other like health markers, which another study is doing right now. So they're replicating the previous one, plus they're looking at grip strength and blood pressure and other things. It's called ABLE trial, and it's probably going to come in a few years or next year or something. Other human clinical trials mostly are around like wound healing. Like there's no evidence that it would help any like age-related diseases or chronic diseases, but there is like that it supports wound healing, maybe like bone density as well. There was like some postmenopausal women who saw some increase in like these bone resorption markers, but they also took calcium AKG compared to regular calcium. So there might be some extra effects from calcium AKG than calcium alone. And interestingly, like for skin benefits, there helps with the wound healing, but it might also support like collagen production. There's no human trials yet, but most of it is on like human cells, skin cells, and that kind of thing. Helps with maybe like barrier function or collagen synthesis in the skin. So yeah, I mean, it should have more human studies to come out, but it's kind of interesting for sure.
It's going to be really intriguing to see that study that Brian Kennedy's doing, which I think is looking at 2 grams of time released AKG, surely calcium AKG, because that's what they're using in Rejuven. And it looks to be a very well-planned study. I like the study design. I looked at it on clinical trials at some point last year. And I do think that there's smoke there. I'm just not sure if there's any fire. And I find it really hard to interpret the research that's been done so far. As you pointed out, Siim, there have been a few beneficial effects reported, as well as the things you mentioned. I think there's been a tiny bit of work on some proxies of physical function. But when you look at those studies, some of them have used calcium AKG, some of them have used ornithine AKG, some of them have used arginine AKG. The doses have varied massively. The ones using calcium have used time-released AKG because normally it's got a vanishingly short half-life. It's 5 minutes or something like that. So wouldn't necessarily expect it to do that much. And therefore, I just don't know what to make of any of it yet. And I won't know what to make of it until we see the results from that particular study. Nice to hear that you're writing that book, Siim. I'm looking forward to reading that. I'm sure within that book, one of the subjects that you've covered is what appears to be one of your favorite subjects, and that is glycine.
Yeah.
Siim's favorite amino acid. Siim, tell us about glycine.
Yeah, I mean, glycine is, I guess the reason I like it is because it's, appears to be very safe, does a whole bunch of different things, and it has benefits from both some human studies and animal studies. Not for all of the proposed benefits, but in human studies, it helps with sleep, helps lowers blood sugar slightly, and if you look at the study with the glyNAC, glycine is 50% of that, so it might also have some effects on inflammation markers, grip strength, and some other functional outcomes, waist circumference, what they measured in the glyNAC studies. But the animal studies, the reason why is thought to have some lifespan effects, it did extend lifespan in the ITP study as well. So one of the reasons it thought is that it mimics methionine restriction, which methionine in excess has been seen to shorten lifespan, but it turns out that it's not only because of the excess methionine, it's more so about the balance between methionine and glycine. So if the mice are on a high methionine diet, if they're getting more glycine as well at the same time, then it doesn't shorten their lifespan. Whereas if they're only extra methionine and low glycine, then that seems that shortens lifespan in many animal models. So in the modern diet, a lot of the foods have more methionine and less glycine, like muscle meats, whereas you get glycine from tendons and ligaments and jello, more like collagenous kind of substances. So that's one of my rationale, is to take glycine for the kind of methionine balance, because I'm not on a zero methionine diet or anything. So it makes sense to kind of balance that. There's no, I think the issue is, again, you don't know necessarily what's the ideal balance. I think Chris Masterjohn did say that something along the lines that for every 4 grams of methionine, you would need 1 gram of glycine, if I'm not mistaken, but I might misquote him. But there's no specific ratio that we know that would be optimal or ideal. I guess that's the challenge. Other things that I think make glycine worthwhile is that it supports collagen synthesis. It's 1/3 of collagen, and collagen supports collagen turnover. There's no human studies that it supports skin anti-aging or wrinkles. There is for collagen, and there's different mechanisms why collagen peptides appear to help with skin wrinkles and aging, but the glycine might be part of the reasons there. And the glutathione we mentioned as well. So the reduction in inflammation in the glyNAC studies comes from the increased glutathione, which a glycine supports with NAC. And interestingly, speaking of the methionine glycine ratio, there's also some human studies that low glycine status is associated with higher visceral fat. And we know that in animal studies that methionine restriction decreases visceral fat. And in humans, methionine restriction also improves insulin sensitivity. So again, might be some of the ratio here, that if you increase the glycine, you might see some improvements in insulin sensitivity, and you might see decreases in visceral fat, which we don't have a study yet. But from my own personal anecdotal experience, I have seen that reducing the methionine and increasing my glycine intake did result in loss of visceral fat to actually very low levels, which might be more dangerous. But from my own experience, it did affect my visceral fat levels as well.
You haven't got any visceral fat, Siim. What are you talking about?
Well, 54 grams is
54 grams. There you go. Oh, dear.
need a microscope to see it.
You missed the most important thing too, which is that glycine basically tastes like sugar.
Yeah,
It's
you can
delicious.
mix it with, so like if you eat like cottage cheese or Greek yogurt, like unflavored for the protein, you can add glycine there for some sweet flavor.
I'm surprised that I'm even mentioning this for fear of embarrassing myself. The strangest thing that I enjoy each day is inulin powder, short chain inulin powder, which is slightly sweet, mixed with glycine powder. It's like candy floss. It's genuinely so nice.
How do you eat that? You just put it on a spoon or what?
Spoon. Straight down the hatch.
Raw dogging it.
Methionine and amino acid balance is a really interesting subject. And I think you're absolutely right about the balance between the amino acids being the thing that matters, rather than methionine restriction per se. And if you haven't read it, then prior to the publication of your book, I would suggest reading a review paper that Steve Ostad wrote about different forms of dietary restriction in which he discusses amino acid restriction, because it is interesting. I don't agree with it all, but I agree with much of it. He goes into some of the specifics of those ratios and how they relate to health outcomes. Another point that I'll flag is that there has been some work looking at glycine and lifespan, and I might be misremembering this, but I believe that it used fish or rats, finding that glycine extended lifespan but didn't push down methionine. And so clearly it's not just exerting any benefits through methionine restriction mimicking. There are probably other facts that are at play too, like change in inflammation. And Nic, I'll turn to you in a minute just to fill in some of those gaps, because I really like a video that you made about glycine, autophagy, mTOR, and how those tie together. And then there does seem to be something of a glycine gap between the amount that our body synthesizes each day and our potential metabolic needs. And there was a review paper that was written about this a few years ago, and I thought that the authors overinterpreted the data a little bit, but I suspect that there is a gap. And certainly, I think most people stand to benefit from increasing their glycine intake a little bit. Happily, it's also very cost effective. It's cheap, as well as being tasty. So it feels like an easy win.
Yeah.
But Nic, I'd love to hear a few of your thoughts, including touching on what those mechanisms might be.
Sure. So I've looked at two different areas for glycine, so I'm definitely not as extensively educated as Siim on this, but I've looked at as I alluded to earlier, the sleep studies in humans, and there's definitely a mild, I don't think the evidence is actually fantastic, but there's definitely a mild effect, it seems like, across, I think, 4 studies in humans. Again, assuming that you're taking it like an hour before sleep, and I think the dose is like 3 grams or something like that. But then I looked at the ITP study, looking at the longevity effect. And in that study, the researchers speculate as to some of the mechanisms. So this is speculation that I'm just kind of conveying from what the researchers say, that glycine, Greg, you may have to refresh my memory if I get one of these details wrong, that glycine, well, actually, I guess I'll start with methionine, that methionine acts on mTOR, which stimulates mTOR, which can lead to the activation of mTOR in a negative way. And I guess over time that you have this continuous overactivation of mTOR. But the way to reduce that, or one of the ways to reduce that, is by the methylation of glycine. That's right. I think the methylation would happen to methionine, making it more potent against mTOR, but glycine somehow interacts in that pathway to stop the methylation, and it itself gets methylated, which allows, I believe, methionine to get removed from the cell. Again, I'm kind of squishy on the details on that. But something along those lines that ultimately acts as this kind of this this triangle effect of methionine with mTOR with glycine that ultimately leads to this life extension effect. And of course, I mean, when you're talking about the ITP, that's when you're talking about doses that don't necessarily translate to humans. But even if we can get a small amount of that through the amounts that we do consume, or if you're an addict like Greg, then shouldn't be a problem. You can just continuously just keep taking glycine, you'll be good to go. But that's my understanding. Oh, and also in the ITP, I think you guys mentioned that there was this life extension effect.
I need some semaglutide to help with my glycine addiction.
There you go.
And what about glyNAC, Nic? Do you think that glyNAC is going to prove to be more effective in helping to slow down the biology of aging than glycine in isolation?
Ooh, that's a really good question. It's tough to answer simply because I haven't looked at some of the. So Siim was talking about some of the effects it has, like on blood sugar and visceral fat and whatnot. I haven't looked at that data, so it seems like maybe there is like. So I don't know how to parse the evidence on glyNAC, which is glycine and N-acetylcysteine. There is a good amount of evidence on N-acetylcysteine itself. I just haven't looked at the glycine side of the equation, but the glyNAC data, which I always add this stipulation that it comes out of one research lab. It's well established. It's out of Baylor University of School of Medicine. It seems like they do pretty great work, but I still wanted to add that disclaimer out there just because I would like to see a lot more data on glyNAC specifically that comes out of some independent labs. But so far, the evidence really, I've found that evidence because I'm pretty conservative when it comes to supplements, and I've been pretty shocked at the effect sizes that they see in the general, just overall. I mean, I was talking about earlier about the functional effects, the organ effects across multiple organ systems, and the effect sizes. glyNAC seems to just crush all that. It has effects on functionality, like muscle function, has effects on mitochondrial function, has effects on blood sugar, has effects on literally everything except I think the only thing that they didn't see an effect in was either like cholesterol or was it blood pressure, one of those. But everything else, and it wasn't like small differences. I mean, over 24 weeks and longer of consumption, you see these really tremendous effects. Keep in mind, this is in people in their 70s. So again, it goes back to the specific population that we're talking about. So would this apply to people who are younger? I think that the answer is probably not. You might see some positive effects, but would you see as great of effects or nearly as great of effects as you would in these 70-year-olds? The answer is no. But I mean, if I were 70 or once I hit 70, and hopefully there's more data on glyNAC at this point to really corroborate what we've seen so far out of this one lab, I am 100% getting on glycine and N-acetylcysteine.
2060, you'll be placing your order.
2060 glyNAC. I think yeah, like it's not gonna, so like, you know, one of the main mechanisms I guess the glyNAC works in those clinical trials is the increased glutathione and reduction in inflammation. So you have to be someone who, you know, has higher inflammation, which, you know, elderly people generally do because of natural aging. So and they have lower glutathione levels. So yeah, they're kind of the prime target to get those impressive results, which, you know, younger people probably wouldn't see, you know, anything, I think, from that mechanism. And yeah, I don't think it's gonna be like some miracle drug, but you know, probably I would probably think that, okay, what supplements I'm gonna give to my aging mother or a grandmother? Like I would probably give them, you know, creatine, and probably give them like glycine and NAC as well. Personally, the problem actually is like the dosage. So in that study, they found that the dosage was quite large. They used something like 100 milligrams per kilogram. So that's like something like 7-8 grams of both glycine and NAC. So you have like a 16-gram serving size. And the lower doses, like, and most supplements are something like one gram is like most supplements, the glyNAC supplements, 1 gram of NAC and 1 gram of glycine. If that, most of the NAC ones are actually even lower than that. So I think the dosage might be also very important, because in that study, the higher doses did have a bigger effect for at least raising glutathione. So the lower dose is something like 2 grams, probably might not be even enough.
And if you haven't tried NAC before, you're in for a treat. It is absolutely delicious. Nearly as good, if not better, than glycine is.
Then you need to double the glycine to counteract.
Double it? I think probably increase it 100-fold.
Yeah, 5-fold the glycine for the taste.
Yeah, I think we need more research, and more research from different labs too. It doesn't strike me that the authors of that have a vested interest, but those clinical trials have all been from the same lab. And I'd argue that there's been one strong study so far, and that's it. And finally, glyNAC is being studied in the ITP. So watch this space. I'm very curious to see how it does, given that glycine led to some small improvements in lifespan. I believe that was true with both males and females. So another amino acid that I think we all have some interest and some affinity for is taurine, which, like glycine, is arguably conditionally essential. Nic, I think one of the most popular videos that you've ever done was on taurine. You took over YouTube for about 48 hours when you published a video about taurine. So tell us about taurine, Mr. Taurine.
Well, that video is a breakdown of this science study that released, I guess, 2 years ago. It's crazy how time flies. Yeah, exactly to your point. It's considered a semi-essential amino acid because they mentioned that blood levels of taurine decrease over time, especially by the age of 60. You're at just a small percentage, a fraction of what you are at what you have when you're like 10 years old or 15 years old. And they found that to be the case across multiple systems. So not just looking at human levels, but also looking at monkeys and mice. And then in this study, which they looked at a whole host of different parameters. I imagine the metformin study, which I haven't looked at, Greg, but I imagine that one probably did something similar. Correct me if I'm wrong. But they looked at just like a ton of different things, right?
Take the taurine paper and multiply that by about 10, and you're nearing what they did in the metformin one.
Okay, that's incredible. I don't know if I want to read it now. It's too much work. Yeah, but the taurine, they looked at DNA damage. They looked at stem cells. They looked at satellite cells. They looked at reactive oxygen species. I mean, everything under the sun they looked at. Apparently not, though. Apparently the metformin paper is much bigger. So they found positive effects across, let's say, fish, mice. Those are the big two. And then they cleverly, which I appreciated, I very much appreciate, because I imagine this took a lot of work to do, just for one figure, just a part of a figure, adding, giving taurine to monkeys, and then doing a number of tests on those monkeys that they also had done in mice. And they showed similar effects across the board just in those measures, which was like something like 8 to 10 measures, which is still a lot, if you're considering the amount of work that gets put into this kind of stuff. So they tried to bring it back to a little bit more of a Homo sapien element. But yeah, across the board, taurine seemed to be extremely beneficial for all these different health span metrics. Also, bone was another one that they looked at. Body weight, body fat, neuromuscular coordination, strength. I mean, anxiety. I mean, it's just a bunch of different things. So the only thing that I call into question with this kind of stuff, these kinds of massive studies, is if you're looking at like mouse anxiety and you are a researcher, I always wonder how much experience you have looking at a metric like mouse anxiety. And are you bringing in a researcher that does have experience on that? Because to be fair, they do have a lot of researchers on this paper. So it is possible they brought in somebody that does know about how to assess mouse anxiety versus mouse memory versus mouse grip strength, all these different aspects. But overall, the point is that the study, which was really influential, found some really positive effects. But then you can go beyond that and look at some of the performance effects that have been looked at with taurine and the effect that it has in exercise training. And it seems to have some positive effects there. And then I've looked at some research on metabolic syndrome. It seems to have some mild positive effects there as well. So overall, it's definitely on near my top list in terms of supplements and amino acids to look at long term, just over the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, I agree. Like, it's hard to say. Like, yeah, it's a miracle molecule, but in humans, it has been proven to help with blood pressure and some other like metabolic health markers. And I guess it's another one of those things that so the larger doses, like 6 grams, have been seen to be more effective for the metabolic syndrome and exercise. And to get 6 grams from food, it's gonna be hard. Like I think the Japanese probably get 6 grams from that because they eat a lot of the seaweeds, which is the highest dietary source of taurine. But other than that, you get it from fish and meat. But you do need to consume something like several kilos of meat to get like 6 grams per day.
Just real quick on the meat aspect, I think something that people often lose sight of is they focus in, again, I keep saying this, but they focus in on one mechanism or they focus in on one molecule like taurine. And they say, well, now I need to eat mass amounts of meat. Meat is therefore good for me because it has taurine in it. And I think we really need to start separating those two concepts. But anyway, just a side note.
But related to that, it does also imply that certain people are more likely to benefit than others, namely people who consume plant-based diets. That's true not just of taurine, because taurine tends to be concentrated in slow twitch muscle fibers. So you get most of it from the dark meat that you would get from turkey or chicken, say, as opposed to the lighter breast meat. But it's also true of creatine.
B vitamins
can be found, creatine can be found in high concentrations, in particular in fast twitch muscle fibers. The lighter muscle, it's true of B vitamins, it's true of glycine, which you're going to find in connective tissues, and it's true of other things too. So just bear that in mind. If you are vegan and you're listening to this, you probably get an outsized benefit from taking some of these things relative to the three of us omnivores. I'm not sure you're an omnivore, Nic, but I believe you are.
On Siim's episode where we discussed my diet, I just said I just don't tell people because people get so mad. They just start dismissing everything you have to say based off of what you eat. So I just don't tell people.
I just eat glycine and
glycivore. Actually, what's the highest source of creatine? It's not like meat. It's actually herring. It's got like twice as much creatine than meat.
Huh.
Yeah. Sardines are very rich as well. And something else to point out with taurine, which is true of glycine too, as far as we can tell, it's got an excellent safety profile. And it's approved by all the different regulatory bodies like EFSA. And that's not true of everything that we've discussed so far. For example, NMN was relatively recently outlawed by the FDA. Nic, I don't think where you are you can get it so readily from supplement stores or Amazon anymore. And I believe that NAC is now in a regulatory grey zone in the States too. Both of them are available over here in Europe.
I think the NAC was redacted.
Was it?
Yeah, but the NMN is still... You can still buy it, I think, but I guess the FDA is like deciding what they're going to do with it. Are they going to make it a prescription drug or not? But I mean, it's going to, it's not a prescription drug. You can get it from, it's a dietary supplement. You can get it from food, of course, in very small amounts, but it's not. So the crystalline MIB 616 is the molecule that David Sinclair is doing with the Metro Biotech, which is a form of NMN. So that's the reason why the FDA is investigating NMN as a pharmaceutical drug, because of the crystalline MIB616, which is theoretically like a pharmaceutical.
So we'll see what happens when he sells that one to GSK.
Yeah. I think that might be the one. Don't quote me on this, but that might be the one that they used in that study that he was involved in. Yeah, beta NMN. Yeah. Okay. Well, sure, the FDA can have it.
Then we have ergothioneine, which is an amino acid thiol, technically, and it's something that we consume in particular from certain strains of mushrooms. And I've developed a very keen interest in ergothioneine in recent times. I'm very optimistic about its promise. To date, there hasn't been that much clinical research. In fact, there are only really a couple of studies looking at functional or morphological outcomes so far. I'll pass this one over to you, Siim. What do you make of ergothioneine? And are you taking ergothioneine?
No. I wrote about it in my last book, The Longevity Leap, but I guess my conclusion was that, it's interesting. You probably want to get it from diet, and there's not enough human studies yet to make any conclusions. So and it's healthy foods have ergothioneine, like mushrooms and different vegetables and stuff. So it's hard to say, is it the ergothioneine itself specifically, or is it these other things in the healthy foods? But it doesn't. You would want to probably eat mushrooms and the vegetables and those different ergothioneine foods anyway. So not sold on supplementation yet.
That relates to that is that the doses of ergothioneine used in studies so far aren't that high. Some of the early work used 5 milligrams, which is a quantity that you could get from a reasonable amount of certain types of mushrooms. It's quite large variation between mushrooms in their ergothioneine contents. But if you consume modest quantities of things like oyster mushrooms, then you'll probably at some point get there. More recently, people are starting to use higher doses, 25 milligrams or so, which you struggle to get through diet alone. And if you scale up the quantities from preclinical lifespan experiments to humans, then we're talking about quite high doses. Whereas one of the things I like about taurine is that if you scale up the quantities that Vijay Yadav used in his experiments to humans, then we're talking about 3 to 6 grams for a 70 kilogram person. And if people are interested in that, then I interviewed Vijay as well for the podcast, and we had a long chat about taurine. Nic, what do you make of ergothioneine? I'm not going to ask you if you take it because Nic's on his top secret diet.
I do not take ergothioneine. It's funny. I can mention supplements. People are like, okay, fine. Perfectly fine. The moment I mention diet, oh my God. Anyway, so I haven't done a ton of research. The only research I've done is that one Spiegelman study that tried to figure out the mechanism of action, which I thought was really interesting. The enzyme that it acts on, gotta love scientists for their creativity in their names. 3-mercaptopyruvate sulfur transferase, or MPST, mitochondrial enzyme, and seems to improve mitochondrial respiration, which is a marker for mitochondrial activity. Looked at the effect that this enzyme has on a number of different enzymes within mitochondria, and just in general seem to have some pretty profound effects. They also looked at exercise, synergistic effect that it has with exercise as well in relation to this enzyme, and again found some pretty remarkable effects. So to me, I mean, Greg, you're probably far more educated on this than I am, but to me, if this translates to humans, I think it's incredibly promising.
I'm excited about it for several reasons. One of them is the basic biology of ergothioneine. It seems to have its own individual transporter, OCTN1, sometimes called the ergothioneine transporter, which is expressed more or less ubiquitously throughout the body, both on cells and on some organelles like mitochondria. And the cells will not only take it up, but actively accumulate it in themselves over time. Initially, it was thought that they do so for its antioxidant properties, but the line of thinking regarding that has changed. The person that's done the most research on ergothioneine, if people want to read more about it, is Barry Halliwell. But various people are now contributing to this body of work. If you look at the preclinical research, then it seems to be good for lots of different organ systems. Many mice models have been studied, looking at everything from how their lungs respond to smoke, to neurodegeneration, to metabolic health. If you look at the lifespan experiments on those animals, then it does seem to extend lifespan, as well as various markers of health span too, which is a conversation for another day, because how we define health span is variable between people. There's no consensus on that just yet. Then there's the epidemiology of ergothioneine intake and levels. Ergothioneine, like many of the things that we mentioned, including taurine, tends to go down with age, and lower levels are found in various different chronic disease states. And lower levels are prospectively associated with increased all-cause mortality, so risk of dying regardless of what the cause is. There have also been some untargeted, unbiased metabolomics analyses where you take a sample from someone, let's say it's a blood sample, and then you measure all the metabolites that you can measure in that sample. And quite consistently, ergothioneine appears out of the midst of hundreds or thousands of metabolomic markers as one of the markers that's most predictive of better future health based on what's been looked at so far. And then we now have these clinical studies, which initially looked at safety. Unsurprisingly, it's very safe when you give people isolated ergothioneine. Again, the doses aren't that dissimilar from what we're consuming just from the diet. And then there have been a couple of studies looking at cognitive function and also some biochemical markers showing that ergothioneine is good for cognition in older adults. So when you put all of that together, plus some of the specific things that we're seeing in those preclinical models, one of which is an improvement in physical function, which we don't necessarily see with some of these other candidate geroprotectors, and the fact that it's going to be relatively low cost, I think, widely available, I don't really see a strong reason to have any concern about taking it. And I think there's a lot of potential upside there.
Interesting.
My best guess is that if you stick it head to head against a lot of these other nutraceuticals, ergothioneine is going to perform really well. But that might be misplaced confidence.
How much would you need?
In the mouse experiments, they use parts per million in the chow normally, don't they? I don't know what it would be, but I also don't know what the optimal human dose will be. I just know that the study doses so far begin at 5 milligrams. And at 5 milligrams, people are seeing some cognitive benefits. So I suspect that that's the low end of the range. And there will be some dose response. And the optimal dose is going to vary between people depending on various factors, because there are differences between people and how readily they take up ergothioneine. Unfortunately, it does seem to be the case with ergothioneine, and this is true of some other candidates, that the ability of older people to take it up might be worse than younger people. And we need more research on that, but that's certainly a possibility. And then just add one more thought going back to the NAD discussion. There was a very interesting series of experiments done quite recently looking at the effects of ergothioneine on lifespan and health span in model organisms. And their data overall suggested that many of the positive effects of ergothioneine were probably mediated by increases in NAD in different tissue compartments. So they looked at tissues like skeletal muscle. But the mechanism is very different from something like nicotinamide, which is providing a precursor to NAD for the salvage pathway. And I'm a little bit hazy on the details, but ergothioneine seemed to be increasing NAD by initially increasing hydrogen sulfide production. And then that hydrogen sulfide persulfidates proteins. So it sticks a sulfide group on proteins as a form of post-translational modification. that then influences the activity of those proteins. And that includes a protein that's involved in producing NAD, and then that in turn boosted NAD levels. And they did various different experiments to show that this rise in NAD seemed to directly contribute to many of the positive effects. So I think that at some point it will be compared head to head with things like NR and NMN for its effects on NAD. And we might find that some combination of them is best. That wouldn't surprise me at all. Maybe, for instance, ergothioneine and trigonelline are particularly good at increasing muscle NAD, whereas NMN and NR are more efficacious in raising levels in the brain. I think we need to do those types of experiments.
Yeah, I think with NAD you need a combination of ingredients to target a different, because there's different reasons why the NAD goes down. Some of it is because of the CD38. Others are like the PARPs from DNA damage.
Yeah, DNA damage and inflammation, I think, are the two big drivers most likely, right?
Yeah.
You said that older individuals don't take up, don't have as much transporter of ergothioneine, the ergothioneine transporter?
I couldn't tell you the specifics there. I don't know if it's to do with expression of the transporter. Something else to consider, and this is true of the NAD precursors too, is that the gut microbiota substantially influence what ends up getting into the bloodstream. So within the gut, the different NAD precursors that you provide, like the NR and the NMN, will be metabolized by some bacteria. So it's not like you put NR in your mouth and then you get a commensurate rise in blood NR. It just crosses the intestinal lining unconverted. That's not the way it works. And it's probably somewhat similar in the case of ergothioneine. It's probably being metabolized by some of those microorganisms. But again, do we have clinical research showing that? Not just yet.
That Spiegelman paper does indicate pretty substantial increases in the ergothioneine transporter from exercise. Obviously, it's in animals, but I wonder if one way around it, one way to maybe increase its bioavailability in the tissues would be through exercise.
Take the example of glucose, but it's going to be true of many different things that active tissues need for optimal function. And it points to the importance of maintaining a healthy lifestyle, because that way, in the case of some of these substances, you're going to get better responses still due to the interaction between them. I don't want to go into creatine because I suspect that each of us has spoken about creatine ad nauseum at some point. I also have one eye on the clock. We've been going for nearly 3 hours so far. So with that in mind, are there one or two supplements that you think that we should discuss before we round things out today that will be of special interest to people listening?
Something I've noticed that people are really interested in is collagen peptides. I don't know if you guys have strong opinions on collagen peptides.
I wouldn't choose collagen peptides just because I don't think of collagen peptides as being a true geroprotector. I see them as being something that supports connective tissue health primarily, and therefore might have some bearing on your physical appearance and the resilience of some of your tissues. So in particular, your tendons and your ligaments.
Yeah.
I don't think that they're targeting the biology of aging per se.
Yeah. Okay. I agree.
I guess astaxanthin is one thing we mentioned. We didn't go into too much detail, but there's the ITP study, extended lifespan by 12%. And there's some nematode study as well that found life extension. Plus, in the human studies, you have that it helps with inflammation markers, and I think cholesterol markers as well was one of the things. And like the skin benefits, like it protects the skin against UV radiation, but that's more the aesthetic side. I do like astaxanthin quite a lot, and I've become more like amazed or interested in it.
I think it's a great choice. That would have been my choice too. If I think about these supplements, the ones I'm probably most excited about are astaxanthin and ergothioneine for quite different reasons. I recognize that there are very different levels of evidence so far. astaxanthin's been much better studied. But as you said, it does seem to have positive effects on lots of different outcomes. To add a couple into the mix, another one would be physical performance, and yet another would be reproductive function. And while it extends lifespan, it does seem to target most of these different hallmarks of aging as well. Read into that as much as you will. I don't read too much into that personally. But when you put all that together, plus the fact that it's a natural part of the human diet, it's the pigment that gives salmon its pink colour for listeners. It's got an excellent safety profile, and it's not particularly expensive. It's a no-brainer for a lot of people. And also, it's in a category of supplements that I'm drawn to, which I see as benefiting adults of all ages, from 18 to the grave. I wouldn't put some things into that category. I wouldn't put berberine into that category, for instance. But I would put taurine and creatine and ergothioneine and astaxanthin and lutein and zeaxanthin. And the magnitude of those benefits is going to fluctuate according to how old you are. But I think that there's evidence for all of those different things for people of different ages. Maybe there's the least evidence for ergothioneine, but its presence in the diet and the mechanisms shown so far and the potential positive effects on body composition, adaptations to exercise training suggests to me that it's going to be something that benefits young people too.
What do you think, Nic?
I agree. I don't really have anything on the top of mind that jumps out to me. I think the list that we have is quite good. We covered a lot. Maybe omega-3s is something that I would throw in there as well, but we covered that as well. So, yeah.
Have you got anything to add there, Nic?
To omega-3s, you mean? I would say just because if you are taking it, yeah, I guess I'll say omega-3s are probably most beneficial for the brain later on in life. I don't think that there's any harm in taking it when you're younger, but I think that the greatest benefit is going to be later on in life. However, if you're taking it for cardiovascular disease risk, I think that it would probably be better to take it earlier in life than it would later. I'm not saying that you shouldn't take it later in life. You should just continuously take it with a little bit of a greater focus on EPA, simply because that one seems to have slightly stronger benefit in relation to cardiovascular disease. And considering that cardiovascular disease, at least the way that we're talking about it, or at least the way I'm talking about it, is in relation to cholesterol deposition and atherosclerosis and whatnot, as well as some morphological changes in some of the heart cells. That should be addressed earlier than later, because once you already have it, it's really difficult to then remove that atherosclerosis. So, yeah, I would throw that in there. But yeah, aside from the ones that we already covered, I think the list looks really good.
See many others?
Nothing that comes to mind immediately. Yeah.
One final question related to supplements. Are there any that haven't been studied in clinical populations yet that you have your eye on as holding special promise?
I have a cheeky response, and I guess I have a real response. I don't.
Give me cheeky.
The cheeky response is C15 fats.
They're essential, right? We already know that.
Yeah, they're essential, all right. Essential
for someone's bottom line.
I was just about to say that. Yeah, aside from that, I think that something I wouldn't say I have my eye on it, because I'm not that bullish on it, but a lot of other people are, and I think that there's at least a potential that it could have an effect, is Urolithin A. I've seen a lot of people discuss it. I've covered some of the studies on it. I'm not that impressed by it, but maybe in the future we'll see some better studies.
Yeah. That's interesting. Like I've looked at the studies as well, and it's done by the company that owns the patent.
Yeah.
Timeline Nutrition, and from that study, like the only thing I saw was hamstring torque increase.
In
That
the
was
most
the only
recent
like
study.
significant effect. It didn't increase grip strength and upper body strength. And I think the endurance thing, that was the kind of funny part, that they measured the endurance in the middle of the study, right? In the middle and in the end. And in the middle of the study, I think it was something like 3 months or something, the Urolithin A group did see endurance increase compared to placebo. But by the 6th month, it decreased, and it was like no difference between placebo. So I say, like, yeah, if you wanted to increase your endurance by taking Urolithin A, you just have to wait 6 months until the end of the study. But yeah, maybe it helps with like the lower body strength, maybe, but upper body strength, even their own studies, the 2 of them, they found no effect on that specific.
Yeah, I've read those studies as well and been entirely underwhelmed by the data that have been published so far. I think a really important point to emphasize here is the disparity between the cost of Urolithin A as Mitopure and the results reported in those studies so far.
It's $100
so
per month.
It's $125 for a month supply. However, the month supply is a 15-day supply. If you look at that second study, there were 2 different experimental groups. One had 500 milligrams, one had 1,000 milligrams. 2 pills is 500 milligrams. You got to take 4 pills to get the 1,000 milligram dose, which tended to statistical significance in a couple of the outcomes they looked at, as well as the effect on hamstring torque. That means $125 for a 15-day supply for something that's having negligible effects. And I think the mechanisms are interesting, so people are interested in it. Primarily is something that's influencing mitophagy, the removal of dysfunctional mitochondria. And clearly, people aren't necessarily that good at making Urolithin A themselves. It's a so-called postbiotic. It's something that your gut bacteria can produce if you consume elager tannins from certain foods like pomegranates. But a lot of people don't make that conversion very effectively. And clearly, supplementing Urolithin A can increase blood levels and therefore bypass that issue. But I'm just really unimpressed by the data. I'm not sure that there's a single ingredient supplement that has clinical research published on it that at that price point has been so unremarkable in the clinical effects. Not to throw your suggestion under the bus, Nic. I don't mean to do that. I'm not ruling it out entirely, but it's not one that I'm personally gravitating to.
Yeah, I think they haven't, studied like, metabolic syndrome or like these chronic diseases. Maybe there might be effects, but for the exercise, unless you want to increase hamstring torque. Then...
And they did find change in some proxies of inflammation and mitochondrial function based on the biochemical analyses they included in those studies. So I'm not saying that it's not having effects. It clearly is. I just think that the cost to benefit ratio makes no sense for anybody apart from millionaires or billionaires.
I think the price is so high because they own the patent and they bar against anyone who tries to make their own Urolithin A with lawsuits.
Right. Just to add one suggestion, there's a flavonoid called nobiletin that I think is really interesting. Have you guys come across that?
No.
It's found in citrus peel. The first time it came on my radar was a paper that Joe Takahashi, who's a scientist I've got a huge amount of respect for, published some work where they used an unbiased chemical screen to look at different natural products that might affect the circadian clock, the molecular clock that ticks in all of our cells and programs the daily schedule of events in those cells. And nobiletin appeared as top hit. And then they looked at its effects on the clock and its effects on mice during aging. They basically found that it has a bunch of positive effects on metabolic health in particular that are mediated by the clock, because they found that if they genetically tampered with the clock and its function, then they abolished the effects of the nobiletin. And then other studies have also found positive effects on things like gut function and immune function and neuroprotection. And so given that I've got my bias that clock dysfunction is one of the hallmarks of aging, it's just that people aren't recognizing that yet. And that's something that we need to target as well, which we can do a little bit. I think a few of these different substances that we've discussed today are affecting the circadian clock. There's evidence for that with ergothioneine. There's very strong evidence for that with lithium. lithium is one of the more potent chronobiotics. At trace doses, that's unlikely the case, though, and we were speaking about trace doses earlier. But when you put all that together, and the effects of nobiletin on the clock, I think it's really interesting, in part because, unlike many of the things that we've discussed, the effects of nobiletin on the clock seem to increase as animals get older, as their clocks function worse and worse. And so it could be that it's becoming more and more beneficial later in life when animals need it the most. So just got one eye on that, because I also suspect that it's going to be something that we find to be safe, because it's just in citrus peel. Intuitively, it makes sense that provided the doses are reasonable, it's probably going to be benign.
Like the energy boosters also act on the circadian clock, right?
They do, through the sirtuins. They should do. And NAMPT, one of the enzymes that you mentioned, which is the rate limiting enzyme in that particular pathway, is clock controlled and ties into one of the feedback loops within the molecular clock. They surely will. And that brings up the point that we need to look at the optimal time at which to take these. It might just be that you need to take them at a consistent time of day if you want to maintain a healthy clock. But it could be that there is a particular phase within the circadian cycle at which it's best to take it. Watch this space. So it's been an absolute pleasure, guys. Thank you for your time. In closing, where would you like to point people? I know that you each have lots of different projects that you're involved in, all very exciting.
Yeah, I'm Siim Land on YouTube and Instagram as well, Twitter, everywhere Siim Land.
Yeah, thanks for having us. This was a blast. Anytime. It's not often that you get to have 3 science-based people that get to sit here and nerd out and discuss all the science at length. So it's a rarity and it's a lot of fun. So thanks. You can find me on Physionic. Just type in physio and then NIC. You'll find me.
First time that I read
it's
that,
Nic.
I was like, Physio Nic? Or is it Physionic? Or how am I pronouncing that one? Because I see what you did there. There's no H.
Yeah, no, there's no H.
It was great fun.